Part 4. The Rivan Queen. Chapter 22. The Princess Tynedra was in a thoughtful, even pensive mood. Much as she had enjoyed the turmoil her periodic outbursts of temper had caused, she rather regretfully concluded that it was probably time to put them aside and make peace with Geryon. They were going to be married, after all, and there was no real point in upsetting him any more than absolutely necessary. Her tantrums had established the fact that although he might outrank her, she would not enter the marriage as his inferior, and that was really all she had wanted anyway. On the whole, the prospect of being married to Geryon was not nearly as unpleasant as she pretended. She did love him, after all, and now that he understood exactly how things were going to stand between them, everything was likely to be quite satisfactory. She decided to find him that very day and make peace with him. The largest part of her attention that spring morning had been taken up by a book on protocol and a chart she was carefully drawing up. As Imperial Princess of Tynedra and Queen of Riva, she would, of course, absolutely outrank every Grand Duchess of every house in the Empire. She was also fairly sure that she outranked Queen Achlina of Cherek and Queen Silar of Belgariad. Maya Serena's status as co-ruler of Arendia raised some problems, however. It was entirely possible that she and Maya Serena were equals. Tynedra made a note on a scrap of parchment, reminding herself to have Ambassador Valgon direct an inquiry to the Chief of Protocol in Tolhanath concerning the matter. She felt a nice little glow as she surveyed her chart. With the exception of Lady Belgariad and the motherly little Queen Layla of Cinderia, to whom everyone deferred because she was such a dear, Tynedra concluded that she would in fact outrank or at least equal every noble lady in the West. Suddenly, there was a shattering thunderclap so violent that it shook the very walls of the citadel. Startled, Tynedra glanced at the window. It was a bright, sunny morning. How could there be thunder? Another rending crash ripped the silence, and there was a frightened babble in the halls. Impatiently, the princess picked up a small silver bell and rang for her maid. "Go see what's happening," she instructed the girl, and returned to her study of the chart she had drawn. But there was another thunderous crash, and even more shouting and confusion in the corridor outside. It was impossible. How could she concentrate with all of that noise going on? Irritably, she rose and went to the door. People were running, actually fleeing. Just down the hall, Queen Layla of Cinderia bolted from the door of Lady Belgariad's private apartment, her eyes wide with terror, and her crown very nearly falling off. "What is the matter, Your Majesty?" Tynedra demanded of the little queen. "It's Belgariad," Queen Layla gasped, stumbling in her haste to escape. "She's destroying everything in sight." "Lady Belgariad?" Another deafening crash sent the little queen reeling, and she clung to Tynedra in terror. "Please, Tynedra, find out what's wrong. Make her stop before she shakes down the entire fortress." "Me? Well, she will listen to you. She loves you. Make her stop." Without pausing to consider the possible danger, Tynedra went quickly to Lady Belgariad's door and glanced inside. The apartment was a total shambles. Furniture was overturned, wall hangings had been ripped down, the windows were shattered, and the air was full of smoke. Tynedra had thrown enough tantrums in her own life to appreciate artistry when she saw it. But the disaster inside Belgariad's apartment was so absolute that it went beyond art into the realms of natural catastrophe. Lady Belgariad herself stood, wild-eyed and disheveled, in the center of the room, cursing incoherently in a dozen languages at once. In one hand she held a crumpled sheet of parchment. Her other hand was raised like a claw before her, half-clenched about an incandescent mass of blazing energy that seemed to have summoned out of air itself, and which she now fed with her own fury. The princess stood in awe as Belgariad began a fresh tirade. The dreadful cursing began in a low contralto and rose in an awful crescendo into the upper registers and beyond. As she reached the limits of her voice, she began slashing the air with the blazing mass in her hand, punctuating each curse with a crackling burst of raw energy that sizzled from between her fingers like a bolt of lightning to shatter whatever her eyes fell upon. With a series of vile oaths, she detonated 6 teacups in a row into shards. Then, quite methodically, she went back down the line, exploding the saucers upon which they had sat. Almost as an afterthought, she blew the table into splinters. Tenedra heard a strangled gasp directly behind her. King Anheg, the blood drained from his face, looked once through the door, then turned and ran.
"Lady Belgariad,"
Tenedra remonstrated to the sorceress, trying not so much to reason with her as to minimize the destruction. Belgariad shattered 4 priceless vases, standing on the mantelpiece with 4 precisely separate explosions. Outside the window, the bright spring morning vanished as if the sun had suddenly been extinguished, and there was a sullen rumble of thunder that Tenedra prayed devoutly was natural.
"Whatever is the matter?"
the princess asked, hoping to draw the enraged sorceress into explanation rather than more curses. It was the curses that had to be headed off. Belgariad seemed to have a deep-seated need to emphasize her oaths with explosions. Belgariad, however, did not reply. Instead, she merely threw the parchment at Tenedra, turned and blew a marble statue into fine white gravel. Wild-eyed, she wheeled about, looking for something else to break, but there was very little left in the smoking room that had not already been reduced to rubble.
"No!"
Tenedra cried out sharply, as the raging woman's eyes fell on the exquisite crystal wren Geryon had given to her. The princess knew that Belgariad valued the glass bird more than anything else she possessed, and she leaped forward to protect the delicate piece.
"Get it!"
Belgariad snarled at her from between clenched teeth.
"Take it out of my sight!"
Her eyes burned with a terrible need to destroy something else. She spun and hurled the incandescent ball of fire she had wielded out through the shattered window. The explosion, when it burst in the suddenly murky air outside, was ghastly. With her fists clenched tightly at her sides, she raised her distorted face and began to curse again. From roiling black clouds that had suddenly appeared out of nowhere, shattering bolts of lightning began to rain down on the island. No longer satisfied with localized destruction, Belgariad expanded her rage to rake the isle and the sea of winds with sizzling fire and ear-splitting thunder. Then, with a dreadful intensity, she raised one fist and suddenly opened it. The downpour of rain she called was beyond belief. Her glittering eyes narrowed, and she raised her other fist. The rain instantly turned to hail, great jagged chunks of ice that crashed and splintered against the rocks to fill the air with flying fragments and thick steam. Tenedra caught up the wren, stooped to grab the rumpled piece of parchment from the floor, then fled. King Anheg poked his frightened face from around a corner. "Can't you stop her?" he demanded in a shaking voice.
"Nothing can stop her, Your Majesty."
"Anheg, get in here!" Belgariad's voice rang above the thunder and the crashing deluge of hail that shook the citadel. "Oh, Balar," King Anheg muttered devoutly, casting his eyes skyward even as he hurried toward Belgariad's door.
"Get word to Val Alorn immediately," she commanded him. "My father, Silk, and Geryon slipped out of the citadel last night. Get your fleet out and bring them back. I do not care if you have to take the world apart stone by stone. Find them and bring them back."
"Belgariad, the king of Carrick faltered.
"Don't stand there gaping like an idiot. Move!"
Carefully, almost with a studied calm, the Princess Tenedra handed the glass wren to her frightened maid.
"Put this someplace safe," she said.
Then she turned and went back to the center of the storm.
"What was that you just said?"
she asked Belgariad in a level voice.
"My idiot father, Geryon, and that disgusting thief decided last night to go off on their own,"
Belgariad replied in an icy voice, made even more terrible by the superhuman control that held it in.
"They did what?"
Tinedra asked.
"They left. They sneaked away during the night." "Then you must go after them."
"I can't, Tinedra." Belgariad spoke as if explaining something to a child.
"Someone has to stay here. There are too many things here that could go wrong. He knows that. He did it deliberately. He has trapped me here." "Geryon?" "No, you silly girl. My father."
And Belgariad began cursing again, each oath punctuated with a crash of thunder. Tinedra, however, scarcely heard her. She looked around. There was really nothing left to break in here.
"You will excuse me, I hope?"
she said. Then she turned, went back to her own rooms, and began breaking everything she could lay her hands on, screeching all the while like a Kamar fishwife. Their separate rages lasted for several hours, and they rather carefully avoided each other during this period. Some emotions needed to be shared, but insane fury was not one of those. Eventually, Tinedra felt she had exhausted the possibilities of her extended outburst, and she settled into the icy calm of one who has been mortally insulted. No matter what faces his illiterate note put on the matter, it would be at the very most a week before the entire world knew that Geryon had jilted her. The flight of her reluctant bridegroom would become a universal joke. It was absolutely intolerable. She would meet the world, however, with a lifted chin and an imperious gaze. However she might weep and storm and rage in private, the face she presented to the world would betray no hint of how deeply she had been injured. All that was left for her was her pride, and she would never abandon that. The Lady Belgariad, however, seemed to feel no need for such imperial reserve. Once her initial fury had subsided to the degree that she allowed her private thunderstorm to pass, a few hardy souls assumed that the worst of it was over. The Earl of Trelheim went to her in an attempt to mollify her. He left her apartment moments later at a run, with her crackling vituperations sizzling in the air about his ears. Barak was pale and shaken when he reported back to the others. "Don't go near her," he advised in a frightened voice. "Do whatever she says as quickly as you can. Stay absolutely out of her sight." "Isn't she calming down at all?" King Rodar asked. "She's finished breaking the furniture," Barak replied. "I think she's getting ready to start on people." Thereafter, each time Belgariad emerged from her apartment, the warning spread instantly, and the halls of Irongrip's citadel emptied. Her commands, delivered usually by her maid, were all variations of the initial orders that she had given to King Anheg. They were to find the vagrant trio and bring them back to face her. In the days that followed, Princess Tinedra's first rage settled into a sort of peevishness that made people avoid her almost as much as they avoided Belgariad. All but gentle Adara, who endured the tiny girl's outbursts with a calm patience. The two of them spent most of their time sitting in the garden adjoining the royal apartments, where Tinedra could give vent to her emotions without fear of being overheard. It was 5 days after Geryon and the others had left before Tinedra discovered the full implications of their departure. The day was warm. Spring came eventually even to a bleak place like Reva, and the small bit of lawn in the center of the garden was a lush green. Pink, blue, and flaming red flowers nodded in their beds as bright yellow bees industriously carried kisses from blossom to blossom. Tinedra, however, did not want to think about kisses. Dressed in her favorite pale green dryad tunic, she bit rather savagely at an unoffending lock of hair, and spoke to the patient Adara at length about the inconstancy of men. It was about mid-afternoon when Queen Layla of Cinderia found them there.
"Oh, there you are,"
the plump little queen bubbled at them. As always, her crown was a little awry.
"We've been looking all over for you." "Why?"
was Sinedra's somewhat ungracious reply. Queen Layla stopped and looked critically at the princess.
"My, aren't we cross today? Just what is your problem, Sinedra? You've barely been civil for days now."
Sinedra caught Adara's warning look to the queen, and that irritated her all the more. Her response was chilly.
"I am finding the experience of being jilted to be just a bit annoying, Your Highness."
Queen Layla's sunny face hardened.
"Would you excuse us, Adara?"
she asked.
"Of course, Your Highness,"
Adara replied, rising quickly.
"I'll be inside, Sinedra,"
she said, and went gracefully out of the garden. Queen Layla waited until the girl was out of earshot, then sat down on a marble bench.
"Come here, Sinedra,"
she said firmly. The princess looked at the motherly little woman, a bit startled by the iron in her voice. Obediently, she went to the bench and sat.
"You really should stop interpreting everything that happens in the world as a personal insult, you know,"
Layla told her.
"That's a very unbecoming habit. What Geryon, Belgariad, and Keldar did has absolutely nothing to do with you."
She looked sternly at Sinedra.
"Do you know anything at all about the prophecy?" "I have heard it,"
Sinedra sulked.
"Tonnerans don't really believe in that sort of thing." "Well, then, that's probably the problem. I want you to listen very carefully, Sinedra. You may not believe, but you will understand."
The queen thought for a moment.
"Why, the prophecy clearly states that when the Rivan King returns, Torak will awaken." "Torak? Oh, that's nonsense. Torak is dead." "Don't interrupt, dear," Layla told her. "You've travelled with him for all that time, and you still don't understand. For a little girl who seems so bright, you are remarkably dense."
Sinedra flushed at that.
"Torak is a god, Sinedra," Layla continued. "He's asleep, not dead. He did not die at Vomembre, much as some people might like to think he did. The instant that Geryon touched the orb, Torak began to stir. Haven't you ever wondered why Polgara insisted that Erend carry the orb back from Rachthol? Geryon could have carried it just as easily, you know."
Sinedra had not thought of that.
"But if Geryon had touched it, still on Angrak's soil and without his sword, Torak might very well have jumped up and gone after him immediately, and Geryon would have been killed." "Killed?"
Sinedra gasped.
"Of course, dear. That's what this is all about. The prophecy says that Torak and the Rivan King will eventually meet, and that in their meeting shall be decided the fate of mankind." "Geryon?"
Sinedra exclaimed, stunned and disbelieving.
"But surely you're not serious." "I've never been more serious in my life, child. Geryon has to fight Torak, to the death, to decide the fate of the world. Now do you understand? That's why Belgariad and Keldar and Geryon left Reva so suddenly. They're on their way to Meloria, so that Geryon can fight Torak. He could have taken an army with him, but he knew that would only cause needless death. That's why the three of them went alone. Now, don't you think it's time that you grew up just a little bit?"
Sinedra was greatly subdued after her conversation with Queen Layla. For perhaps the first time in her life she began to think more about someone else than she did about herself. Oh, she worried constantly about Geryon, and at night she had dreadful nightmares about hideous things that could happen to him. To make matters worse, there seemed to be a persistent buzzing in her ears that was at times quite maddening. It was rather like the sound of voices coming from a long way off, voices that verged just on the edge of being understandable, but never quite were. The buzzing sound, coupled with her anxiety about Geryon, made her moody and frequently short-tempered. Even Adara began to avoid her. The irritating sound in her ears continued for several days before she discovered, quite by accident, the significance of it. The weather on the Isle of the Winds was never really very good, and spring was a particularly unpredictable time of year. A series of storms, following one after another in dreary progression, lashed at the rocky coast, and nasty little rain squalls swept the city and the island. One somber, rainy morning, the princess sat in her chambers, looking glumly out the window at the soggy garden. The fire, which crackled on her hearth, did little to warm her mood. After a while she sighed, and for want of anything better to do, she sat at her dressing table and began to brush her hair. The silver flicker at her throat distracted her eye momentarily as she looked at herself in the mirror. It was the medallion Geryon had given her just after her birthday. She had, by now, grown accustomed to it being there, though the fact that she could not take it off caused her periodic fits of anger even still. Without actually thinking about it, she stopped brushing and touched the amulet with her fingertips. "But we can't do a thing until the Arrens and the Tonnedrans are fully mobilized." It was the voice of King Rodar of Drasnia. Tinedra started and turned quickly, wondering why the portly monarch had entered her room. As soon as she removed her fingers from the silver amulet, the voice stopped. Tinedra looked around, puzzled. She frowned and touched the amulet again. "No, no," another voice said. "You don't add the spices until after it starts to boil." Tinedra again removed her fingertips from the talisman at her throat, and that voice, too, stopped abruptly. Fascinated, she touched it for the third time. "You make up the bed, and I'll straighten up. We'll have to hurry. The Queen of Kerek might come back at any minute." Wonderingly, the princess touched the amulet again, and again. Her ears ranged randomly through the citadel. "The fire's too hot. This iron will scorch anything it touches." Then she heard a snatch of whispered conversation. "What if somebody comes?" "Nobody's going to come," the young man's voice, which replied, had a peculiar wheedling quality. "We're all safe, cozy here, and I really do love you." Tinedra quickly jerked her fingers from the amulet, blushing furiously. At first there was no direction to it, but as the princess experimented, she gradually learned to focus this peculiar phenomenon. After a couple of hours of intense concentration, she found that she could skim rapidly through all of the talking that was going on in a given quarter of the citadel, until she found a conversation that interested her. In the process, she learned many secrets, some very interesting, some not very nice. She knew that she should feel guilty about her surreptitious eavesdropping, but for some reason she did not. "Thy reasoning is sound, Your Majesty," it was Mandaralan's voice. "King Coradulan is committed to the cause, though it will take some weeks for his courtiers to gather the forces of Orendia. Our major concern must be the position the Emperor will take in the affair. Without the legions, our situation is perilous." "Ranbarun has no choice in the matter," King Anheg declared. "He is bound by the provisions of the Accords of Omimbre." Brand, the Rivan warder, cleared his throat. "I don't think it's that simple, Your Majesty," he said quietly in his deep voice. "The Accords state that the kingdoms of the West must respond to a call from the Rivan King, and Belgariad is not here to issue that call." "We are acting in his behalf," King Kohag asserted. "The problem lies in convincing Ranbarun of that," Rodar pointed out. "I know the Tolnedrans.
They'll have whole battalions of legal experts working on the accords. Unless Belgariad himself meets Ranborun face-to-face and issues his command in person, the Emperor will take the position that he is not legally bound to join us. The Rivan King is the only one who can issue a call to war.
Tinedra let her fingertips drop from the amulet at her throat. An idea was beginning to take shape in her mind. It was an exciting idea, but she was not at all certain that she could bring it off. Elorns, she knew, were stubborn and reluctant to accept any new ideas. She quickly laid aside her hairbrush and went to a small chest standing against the wall near the window. She opened the chest and began rummaging through it. After a moment, she found the tightly rolled parchment she had been seeking. She unrolled it and read through it quickly until she found the passage she wanted. She read it carefully, several times. It seemed to say what she wanted it to say. She considered the idea throughout the rest of the day, the possibility that anyone might succeed in catching up with Geryon and stopping him was remote, to say the very least. Belgarath and Prince Keldar were too skilled at evasion to allow themselves to be easily caught. Chasing them was simply a waste of time. Since Polgara was not yet rational enough to see things in this light, it fell to Tinedra to take immediate steps to minimize Geryon's danger once he had entered the lands of the Angarax. All she had to do now was to convince the Elorn kings that she was the logical one to take those steps. It was still raining the next morning, and she rose early to make her preparations. She must, of course, look positively regal. Her choice of an emerald velvet gown and matching cape was artful. She knew that she was stunning in green, and her circlet of gold oak leaves was enough like a crown to convey the right suggestion. She was glad she had waited until morning. Men were easier to deal with in the morning, she had discovered. They would fight her at first, and she wanted the idea implanted in their minds before they were fully awake. As she gave herself a last-minute check in the tall mirror in her dressing room, she gathered her determination and marshaled all of her arguments. The slightest objection must be met instantly. Carefully, she put herself in an imperial frame of mind, and taking the rolled parchment, she moved toward the door. The council chamber in which the Elorn kings usually gathered was a large room high up in one of the massive towers of the citadel. There were heavy beams on the ceiling, a deep maroon carpet on the floor, and a fireplace at the far end big enough to stand in. Maroon drapes flanked the windows where tatters of rain slashed across the solid stones of the tower. The walls of the chamber were covered with maps, and the large table was littered with parchments and ale cups. King Unheg, in his blue robe and dented crown, sprawled in the nearest chair, as shaggy and brutish-looking as always. King Rodar was vast in his crimson mantle, but the other kings and generals wore rather plain clothing. Tinedra entered the chamber without knocking, and stared regally at the somewhat confused men who struggled to their feet in acknowledgment of her presence. "Your Highness," King Rodar began with a portly bow, "you honor us. Was there—"
"Your Majesty," she responded with a little curtsy. "And gentlemen, I find that I need your advice in a matter of state."
"We are all at your immediate disposal, Your Highness," King Rodar replied, with a sly little twinkle in his eyes.
"In the absence of King Belgariad, it appears that I must act in his stead," Tinedra announced, "and I need your advice on how to proceed. I wish the transfer of power into my hands to go as smoothly as possible."
They all stared at her disbelievingly. King Rodar recovered his wits first.
"An interesting proposal, Your Highness," he murmured politely. "We have, however, made other arrangements. There's a long-standing precedent in the matter. We thank Your Highness for her gracious offer nonetheless."
"It was not precisely an offer, Your Majesty,"
Tinedra told him,
"and any previous precedents have been superseded."
King Unheg was spluttering, but Rodar was already moving along smoothly. Tinedra realized that the rotund Drasnian king was likely to be her most serious adversary, or her most effective ally.
I'll be fascinated to examine the instrument vesting your highness with royal authority, he said. I presume that the parchment you carry is relevant?
It is indeed, your majesty. The document quite clearly lists my responsibilities.
May I?
Rodar asked, extending his hand. Tinedra handed him the parchment, and he carefully unrolled it.
Your Highness, this is your betrothal agreement. Perhaps you meant to bring a different document?
The pertinent material is contained in the 4th paragraph, your majesty.
Rodar quickly read the paragraph, frowning slightly.
What does it say, Rodar?
King Anheg asked impatiently.
Interesting,
Rodar murmured, scratching his ear.
Rodar, Anheg complained. What does it say?
King Rodar cleared his throat and began to read aloud.
It is agreed that King Belgariad and his queen shall rule jointly, and that in his absence shall she assume fully the duties and authority of the Rivan throne.
Let me see that, Anheg demanded, snatching the parchment from Rodar.
It doesn't mean anything, Brand declared. She isn't his queen yet. She won't be until after the wedding.
That is only a formality, my lord warder,
Tinedra told him.
A rather important one, I'd say,
he retorted.
The precedent is well established. When a king dies, the next in line assumes the duties of the crown, doesn't he? Even though there has not been a formal coronation?
That's different, Brand growled.
I fail to see the difference, my lord. I have been designated Belgariad's co-ruler. In his absence or an emergency, I am obliged to take command. It is my right and my responsibility. The formalities may have to wait, but I am the Rivan Queen. This is King Belgariad's will and intent. Will you defy your king?
There is something to what she says, my lord warder, the Earl of Selene mused. The document is quite clear.
But look at this,
Anheg said triumphantly.
In paragraph 2 it says that should the wedding not take place, all gifts are to be returned. The wedding has not taken place.
I'm not sure that power is a gift, Anheg, King Fulrak suggested.
You can't give it and then take it back. There's no way she can rule, Anheg declared stubbornly. She doesn't know the first thing about Elrons.
Neither did Gerion, King Hohag murmured in his quiet voice. She can learn the same way he did. Tinedra had been rather carefully assessing their mood. Most of them seemed willing at least to consider her idea. Only the 2 conservatives, Brand and Anheg, were actually resisting. It seemed the time now for a dignified withdrawal coupled with a disarming offer.
I will leave you gentlemen to discuss the matter, she declared somewhat loftily. I would like you to know, however, that I realize the gravity of the situation confronting the West.
She deliberately put on a winsome little girl face.
I am only a young girl, she confessed, unused to the intricacies of strategy and tactics. I could never make any decisions in that area without the fullest advice from you gentlemen.
She curtsied then to King Rodar, choosing him deliberately.
Your Majesty, she said, I shall await your decision.
He bowed in response a bit floridly. Your Majesty, he replied with a sly wink. Tinedra retired and literally flew down the corridors to her own quarters. Breathlessly she closed the door behind her and touched the talisman at her throat with trembling fingertips. She sorted quickly through random conversation until she found the one she wanted.
Refuse to be a party to an absurdity,
Anheg was saying.
Anheg, my friend,
King Fulrak of Cinderia said with surprising firmness.
Yeah, my dear brother king,
But you do have a few blind spots. Wouldn't it be more statesmanlike to consider the advantages and disadvantages of the situation dispassionately?
The Alons will never follow her, Anheg declared. That's a major disadvantage right there.
The Alons will follow us, though, King Hohag said quietly. She is only going to be a figurehead, after all, a symbol of unity.
I suspect that Hohag has hit the exact point we should examine most closely, King Rodar urged. My apologies, Baron Andorallen, but the Arrens are totally disunited. Asturia and Mimbre are hovering on the verge of reopening hostilities, and the call from King Coradulan could very possibly be ignored in northern Arindia, in which case the Mimbrate Knights would almost be compelled to stay home to defend against possible Asturian uprisings. We have to have someone who can make them forget their squabbles and join with us. We need the Asturian bowmen and the Mimbrate Knights.
I most sadly concur, Your Majesty, Mandaralan agreed. My poor Arindia must needs be united in one cause from the outside. We are not wise enough to unify ourselves.
Trinedra can serve us there as well as Garion could have done, Barak reasoned. I don't think anybody expected him to be a general. All we were going to do was to put the crown on him and let him ride at the head of the army. And the Arrens get all gushy and romantic about pretty girls. That betrothal document makes her claim at least semi-legitimate. All we'd have to do is to act as if we accepted her and talk very fast. Add the prospect of a nice little war someplace, and the Arrens will unite behind us, I think. The main point to consider, though, King Rodar emphasized, is the impact she's going to have in Tunedra. Ranbarun dotes on her, and he might agree to lend her his legions, at least some of the time, which he would never do if we were the ones asking it of him. He'll see the political advantage of having her in command almost immediately. We need those legions. I personally do not like the Tonedrans, but the legions are the finest fighting force in the world. I would bend my knee to Tynedra if I have to in order to get them. Let her play queen if she wants to.
Tynedra smiled. Things were going even better than she had expected. All in all, she was quite pleased with herself as she sat down at her dressing table and began to brush her hair, humming softly all the while. Chapter 23. Delban, the armorer, was a gruff, bald man with broad shoulders, huge calloused hands, and a grizzled beard. He was a craftsman, an artist, and he had absolutely no respect for anyone. Tynedra found him to be impossible.
"I don't make armor for women,"
was his initial response to her inquiry when she, accompanied by Dernick the smith, entered his shop. He then turned his back on her and began pounding noisily on a sheet of glowing steel. It took the better part of an hour to convince him even to consider the idea. The heat shimmered out of his glowing forge, and the red brick walls seemed to reflect the heat and intensify it. Tynedra found herself perspiring heavily. She had made some sketches of what she thought might be a suitable design for her armor. All in all, she thought it would look rather nice, but Delban laughed raucously when he saw them.
"What is so amusing?"
"You'd be like a turtle and something like that," he replied. "You wouldn't be able to move."
"The drawings are only intended to give you a general idea," she told him, trying to keep a grip on her temper.
"Now, why don't you be a good girl and take these to a dressmaker?" he suggested. "I work in steel, not brocade or satin. Armor like this would be useless, so uncomfortable that you wouldn't be able to wear it."
"Then modify it," she grated from between clenched teeth.
He glanced at her design again, then deliberately crumpled her drawings in his fist and threw them into the corner. Foolishness, he grunted. Tinedra resisted the urge to scream. She retrieved the drawings.
What is the matter with them?
She persisted. Too much here. He stabbed a thick finger at the shoulder represented on the drawing. You wouldn't be able to lift your arm. And here, he pointed at the armhole in the breastplate she had drawn. If I make it that tight, your arms would stick straight out. You wouldn't even be able to scratch your nose. As long as we're at it, where did you get the whole notion in the first place? Do you want a mail shirt or a breastplate? You can't have both.
Why not?
The weight. You wouldn't be able to carry it.
Make it lighter, then. Can't you do that?
I can make it like cobwebs if you want, but what good would it be if I did? You could cut through it with a paring knife. Tinedra drew in a deep breath.
Master Armorer,
she said to him in a level voice,
look at me. In all of the world, do you think there is a single warrior small enough for me to fight?
He considered her tiny form, scratching his bald head and looking down at her with pursed lips. You are a bit undergrown. If you aren't going to fight, why do you need armor?
It's not actually going to be armor,
she explained to him rather impatiently.
But I need to look like I'm wearing armor. It's sort of in the nature of a costume.
She saw instantly that her choice of words had been a mistake. Delvin's face darkened, and he threw her drawings away again. It took another 10 minutes to mollify him. Eventually, after much wheedling and outrageous flattery, she persuaded him to consider the whole notion as something in the nature of an artistic challenge. All right, he surrendered finally with a sour look. Take off your clothes.
What?
Take your dress off. I need exact measurements.
Do you realize what you're suggesting?
Little girl, he said testily, I am a married man. I've got daughters older than you. You are wearing underclothes now, aren't you?
Yes, but...
That will satisfy the demands of modesty. Take off that dress. With a flaming face, Tinedra removed her dress. Dernick, the smith, who had watched the entire exchange from the doorway with an open grin on his face, politely turned his back. You ought to eat more, Delvin told her. You're as scrawny as a chicken.
I can do without the comments,
she replied tartly.
Get on with this. I'm not going to stand around in my chemise all day.
Delvin picked up a piece of stout cord with knots tied in it at regular intervals. He took a great many measurements with the cord, meticulously recording them on a piece of flat board. All right, that ought to do it. Go ahead, get dressed again. Tinedra scrambled back into her dress.
How long will it take?
2, maybe 3 weeks.
Impossible, I need it next week.
2 weeks, he repeated stubbornly.
10 days,
she countered. For the first time since she had entered his workshop, the blunt man smiled. She's rather used to getting her own way, isn't she? He observed to Dernick. Well, she's a princess, Dernick informed him. She usually gets what she wants in the end. All right, my scrawny little princess, Delvin laughed at her. 10 days. Tinedra beamed at him.
I knew you would see it my way.
Precisely 10 days later, the princess, with Dernick once again in tow, returned to Delvin's workshop. The mail shirt the craftsman had fashioned was so light that it could almost have been described as delicate. The helmet, hammered from thin steel, was surmounted with a white plume, and was encircled with a gold crown. The greaves, which were to protect the fronts of Tinedra's legs, fit to perfection. There was even an embossed shield rimmed with brass and a light sword with an ornate hilt and scabbard. Tinedra, however, was staring disapprovingly at the breastplate Delvin had made for her. It would quite obviously fit too well.
Didn't you forget something?
She asked him. He picked the breastplate up in his big hands and examined it. It's all there, he told her. Front, back, all the straps to hook them together. What else did you want?
Isn't it a trifle understated?
Tinedra suggested delicately. It's made to fit, he replied. The understatement isn't my fault.
I wanted a little more—"
She made a sort of curving gesture with her hands. "What for?"
"Never mind what for. Just do it."
"What do you plan to put in it?"
"That's my business. Just do it the way I told you to."
He tossed a heavy hammer down onto his anvil. "Do it yourself," he told her bluntly.
"Dernick,"
Sinedra appealed to the smith. "Oh, no, Princess. I don't touch another man's tools. That just isn't done."
"Please, Stelban,"
she wheedled. "It's foolishness," he told her, his face set.
"It is important," she coaxed. "If I wear it like that, I'll look like a little boy. When people see me, they have to know that I am a woman. It's terribly, terribly important. Couldn't you, just a little bit?"
She cupped her hands slightly. Delbin gave Dernick a disgusted look. "You had to bring her to my workshop, didn't you?" "Everybody said you were the best," Dernick replied mildly.
"Just a little bit, Delban,"
Sinedra urged. He gave up. "Oh, all right," he growled, picking up his hammer. "Anything to get you out of my shop. But not clear out to here." He made an exaggerated gesture.
"It would depend on your good taste, Delban,"
she smiled, patting his cheek with a fond little laugh.
"Shall we say tomorrow morning?"
The armor, Sinedra decided the following morning as she inspected herself in the mirror, was perfect.
"Well, what do you think, Adara?"
she asked her friend.
"It looks very nice, Sinedra,"
the tall girl replied, although a bit dubiously.
"It's just exactly right,"
Sinedra said happily, turning so that the blue cape fastened to the shoulder pieces of the breastplate flared and swirled dramatically. The gleaming mail shirt she wore under the breastplate reached to her knees and wrists. The greaves covering her calves and the arm guards reaching to her elbows were inlaid with brass. Delbin had steadfastly refused the notion of gold. The armor did chafe a bit through the thick linen undershirt she wore, Sinedra privately admitted, but she was prepared to accept that. She brandished her sword, studying the effect in her mirror.
"You are holding it wrong, Sinedra,"
Adara suggested politely.
"Show me,"
Sinedra said, handing over her sword. Adara took the weapon and gripped it firmly, its point low. She looked extremely competent.
"Where did you ever learn to do that?"
Sinedra asked her.
"We are given instruction,"
Adara replied, handing back the sword.
"It is traditional." "Help me on with my shield,"
said Sinedra. Between them, they managed to gird the princess in all of her warlike equipment.
"However do you keep it from getting tangled up in your legs?"
Sinedra demanded, fumbling with the long scabbard at her waist.
"Hold on to the hilt,"
Adara told her.
"Do you want me to go along?"
Sinedra thought about that as she smoothed her hair and settled her plumed helmet more firmly in place.
"I guess not," she decided rather reluctantly. "I think I'll have to face them alone. Do I really look all right?" "You will be fine,"
Adara assured her. A sudden thought struck the princess.
"What if they laugh?"
she demanded in a frightened voice.
"You could draw your sword on them, I suppose,"
Adara replied gravely.
"Are you making fun of me, Adara?" "Of course not, princess,"
Adara answered with an absolutely straight face. When Sinedra reached the door to the council chamber, she drew in a deep breath and entered, once again without knocking. Knocking would have been inappropriate, suggesting somehow that she had doubts about her right to be there.
"Well, gentlemen,"
she said to the assembled kings and generals, as she stepped to the center of the room where they could all see her. King Rodar rose politely. "Your Majesty," he greeted her, bowing. "We were curious about your absence. The reason is now abundantly clear."
"Do you approve?"
she could not help asking. She turned so they could all see her armor. King Rodar looked at her, his eyes speculative. "It is impressive, don't you think?" he said to the others. "Just the right touches in the right places. The Arryns will flock to her, and the Tolnedrans. Well, we will have to see about the Tolnedrans.
King Onheg looked like a man having a serious struggle with himself.
Why do I feel that I'm being pushed into something? He complained. The very notion of this makes my blood cold. But I can't think of any rational arguments against it.
He critically scrutinized Tsenedra.
She doesn't really look all that bad, does she? He conceded grudgingly. It is absolutely unnatural, of course, but the armor does add something. This might even work.
I am so glad I meet with your Majesty's approval.
Tsenedra almost gushed at him. She tried to curtsy, but her armor made that impossible. She gave a helpless little laugh and fluttered her eyelashes at the brutish-looking king of Kerek.
Don't do that, Tsenedra, he told her irritably. I'm having enough trouble with this as it is.
He almost glared at her.
All right, he said finally. As long as we all understand that she is not going to make any decisions, I will go along with the idea. I don't like it much, but that is beside the point, I suppose.
He stood up and bowed to her.
Your Majesty, he said, looking as if the words nearly choked him.
Tsenedra beamed at him and instinctively tried to respond to his bow.
Don't bow, Tsenedra, he advised her with a pained look. The Overlord of the West does not bow to anyone.
He turned in exasperation to the King of Drasnia.
That isn't going to work, Rodar. What are we going to call her? The Overlady of the West? We'll be the laughing stock of the 12 kingdoms if we do. We call her the Rivan King, my dear Onheg, King Rodar replied urbanely, and we break the head of any man who refuses to bow to her. You can count on that, Onheg scowled. If I bow to her, everybody's going to bow to her.
I'm glad that's all been settled.
A familiar voice came from a dim corner of the council chamber.
Lady Belgariad,
Tsenedra gasped with a certain confusion.
I did not realize you were here.
That's fairly obvious, Belgariad replied. You have been busy, haven't you, dear?
Tsenedra
faltered. Belgariad carefully set down her teacup and moved into the light. Her face was serious, but there was a faintly amused twinkle in her eyes as she examined the armor-clad princess.
Very interesting,
was all she said.
Tsenedra was crushed.
Gentlemen, Belgariad said to the council, I am sure you still have much to discuss. In the meantime, Her Majesty and I need to have a little discussion of our own. I am sure you'll excuse us. She moved toward the door. Come along, Tsenedra, she said, without so much as a backward glance. Trembling, the princess followed her from the room. Belgariad said nothing until the door to her own chambers had closed behind them. Then she turned and looked gravely at the princess in her armor. I have heard about what you've been up to, Tsenedra. Would you care to explain?
They were all arguing so much,
Tsenedra began lamely.
They needed somebody to unite them.
And you decided to take that upon yourself?
Well, how did you know they were arguing?
Tsenedra flushed guiltily.
I see, Belgariad murmured. You have discovered how to use my sister's amulet. How clever of you. Let me do it, Lady Belgariad, Tsenedra pleaded suddenly. Let me lead them. I know I can do it. Let me prove that I'm fit to be Gerian's queen.
Belgariad gazed at her thoughtfully.
You are growing up very rapidly, Tsenedra, she said finally. You will let me do it? We will talk about it. Take off your helmet and shield, dear, and stand your sword over in the corner. I'll make us a nice cup of tea, and you can tell me exactly what you've got in mind. I would rather not have any surprises once we get started in this. You are going with us?
For some reason that startled Tsenedra.
Well, of course I am,
Belgariad told her. She smiled then.
Possibly I can keep at least you out of trouble.
I seem not to have had much success with Garion." She stopped and looked rather pointedly at Tzenedra's breastplate. "Isn't that a trifle overdone, dear?" Tzenedra blushed.
"I thought it would be more... well..."
She floundered with it defensively.
"Tzenedra," Belgariad told her, "you don't have to be so self-conscious. You are still a young girl, after all. Give it some time. Things will improve." "I am so flat," the princess wailed, almost in despair about it. A thought occurred to her. "Do you suppose that you could, well—" She made a sort of gesture. "No, dear," Belgariad said firmly. "That would not be a good idea. It would do some very strange things to certain necessary balances within you. And those are not the sort of things to be tempered with. Just be patient. If nothing else, a few children will fill you out." "Oh, Lady Belgariad," Tzenedra said with a helpless little laugh, "you seem to know everything. You're like the mother I never had."
Impulsively, she threw her arms about Belgariad's neck. Belgariad wrinkled her nose.
"Tzenedra," she suggested, "why don't you take off your armor? You smell like an iron pot."
Tzenedra began to laugh. In the days that followed, a number of people left Riva on important missions. Barak sailed north to Val Alorn to attend the outfitting of the Carrick fleet. Mandaralan left for Vomimbre to report to King Coradolan. The fiery young Leldarin, who had received a pardon at Garion's request, took ship to return to Asturia to make certain preparations there. Hetar, Relg, and Colonel Brendig departed for Kamar, where they would separate and each would return home to oversee the final stages of the mobilization. Events, which always moved at their own pace, began to stir and quicken as the West moved inexorably toward war. Chapter 24. Princess Tzenedra soon discovered that Alorns were a surprisingly emotional people. She was forced from the outset to abandon the stereotyped Tolnedran view of this northern race as brutish savages, ravening on the extreme edges of civilization. She found them instead to be an extraordinarily complex people, often capable of an extreme range of highly subtle emotions. There was nothing subtle, however, about the apoplectic fury of King Anheg of Carrick, when he came bursting into the council chamber a few days later with his eyes bulging and his face aflame. "Do you have any idea what you have done?" he bellowed at Tzenedra.
"Done to what, your majesty?"
she replied calmly. "To Carrick," he shouted, his dented crown sliding down over one ear. "This little game you've been playing gave my wife the brilliant idea that she's going to run my country while I'm gone."
"She is your wife, King Anheg," Tzenedra pointed out coolly. "It is only proper that she should mind the kingdom in your absence."
"Mind?" he almost screamed. "Eiglina doesn't have a mind. There is nothing between her ears but empty air."
"Why did you marry her, then?"
"It certainly wasn't for her mind." "She might surprise you, Anheg," King Rodar suggested with an amused look on his face. "The only thing that would be a surprise to me would be to find anything left when I get back," Anheg retorted, collapsing in a chair. "And there's nothing I can do to stop her. No matter what I say, she will assume the throne as soon as I leave. It's going to be a disaster. Women have no business in politics. They are too weak-brained for it." "I'm afraid that suggestion won't endear you very much in this particular company, Anheg," King Rodar chuckled, glancing at Belgariad. One of her eyebrows had shot up at Anheg's last remark. "Oh, sorry, Belgariad," Anheg muttered, embarrassed. "I did not mean you, of course. I don't really think of you as a woman." "I wouldn't pursue it any further, Anheg," King Rodar advised him. "You have blundered quite enough for one day already."
"That's all right, Rodar," Belgariad said in a frigid tone. "I find the observations of the King of Carrick most interesting."
Anheg winced. "I really can't understand you, my friend," King Rodar said to Anheg. "You've given yourself the finest education in the north. You have studied art and poetry and history, and the philosophies. But on this one subject, you are as blind as an illiterate peasant. What disturbs you so much about the idea of a woman with authority?" It's unnatural," Anhig blurted. "Women were not meant to rule. The whole idea violates the order of things."
"I'm not certain that we are getting anywhere with this," Belgariad observed. "If you gentlemen will excuse us, Her Majesty and I still have preparations to make."
She rose and led Tsinedra from the council chamber.
"He's very excitable, isn't he?"
Tsinedra said, as the two of them passed through the corridors of Iron Grip's citadel toward Lady Polgara's apartments.
"He tends to be overdramatic at times," Polgara replied. "These outbursts of his are not always genuine. Sometimes he behaves the way he does because he thinks people expect it of him."
She frowned slightly.
"He is right about one thing, though. Ailina is not qualified to rule. I think we will have to have a talk with her, and with the other ladies as well."
She opened the door to her apartment, and the two of them went inside. Most of the damage that had resulted from Polgara's vast rage had been repaired, and there remained only a few scorch marks on the stone walls to testify to the violence of her fury. She seated herself at a table and turned again to the letter which had arrived that morning from Queen Porin in Brasnia.
"I think it is rather obvious that we are not going to be able to catch up with my father and the others now. But at least there is one thing we won't have to worry about any more," she observed somewhat regretfully. "Which one is that?" Tsinedra asked, seating herself across the table from Polgara. "There had been some question about my father's recovery from that collapse he suffered last winter, but from what Porin says he is completely back to normal, although that's not an unmixed blessing." She laid Porin's letter aside. "I think the time has come for us to have a little talk, Tsinedra. You have done a great deal of maneuvering and manipulating in the past few weeks. Now, I want to know exactly what's behind it all. Precisely why have you seen fit to ram your new status down everyone's throat?"
Tsinedra flushed.
"I am the Rivan Queen, after all, Lady Polgara," she replied stiffly. "Don't be absurd. You are wearing a fictional crown because Rodar decided to let you wear it, and because he has convinced Anheg and Brand and Kohag that you are not going to do any damage. Now, what is behind all of this?"
Polgara's look was very direct, and Tsinedra squirmed uncomfortably.
"We have to bring in the errands, and my father's legions," she said, as if that explained it. "That's fairly obvious. But the Alorn kings would not be able to do it." "Why not?" "Because a committee cannot win people's hearts."
It was out in the open now, and Tsinedra rushed on.
"Gerion could have done it. The entire West would have risen at the call of the Rivan King. But Gerion is not here, so somebody else has to do it. I have studied history, Lady Polgara. No army led by a committee has ever succeeded. The success of an army depends upon the spirit of the soldiers, and the soldiers have to have one leader, someone who fires their imagination." "And you have elected yourself?" "It doesn't have to be anybody brilliant or anything, not really. It has just got to be somebody visible and unusual." "And you think that a woman is going to be unusual enough and visible enough to raise an army? And, incidentally, to pose enough of a threat to attract the undivided attention of Tower Ugos and Zakath, the Malorian Emperor?" "Well, it has never been done before." Tsinedra felt a little defensive about it. "A lot of things have never been done before, Tsinedra. That is not necessarily the best recommendation. And what convinced you that I was not qualified?"
Tsinedra swallowed hard.
"You were so angry," she faltered. "And I was not sure how long you were going to stay angry. Somebody had to take charge immediately. Besides," she hesitated. "Go on." "My father doesn't like you?" Tsinedra blurted. "He has never ordered his legions to follow you. I am the only one who has a chance to convince him that he ought to join us. I'm sorry, Lady Polgara, I did not mean to offend you."
Polgara, however, waved that aside. Her face was thoughtful as she considered Sinedra's arguments.
"It would seem that you have given the matter some thought," she concluded. "All right, Sinedra. We will try it your way, for now. Just don't do anything exotic. Now, I think we had better have a talk with the ladies."
The conference that took place in Polgara's apartments that afternoon concerned matters of state. She waited quietly until the little group had all gathered, and then she spoke to them rather gravely.
"Ladies," she began, "in a very short time, the Alorns and others will be taking the field on an expedition of some importance."
"You mean war, Paul?"
Queen Layla asked in a sinking voice.
"We are going to try to avoid that, if it is at all possible," Polgara replied. "At any rate, the departure of your husband and the Alorn kings will leave affairs at home in your hands, and the same holds true for each of you. I wanted to go over a few things with all of you before we left."
She turned to Queen Aelina, who was splendidly gowned in red velvet.
"Your husband is somewhat less than enthusiastic about any arrangements that will leave you in charge of Carrick, Aelina."
Aelina sniffed.
"Anheg can be tiresome at times. Try not to agitate him. Drop a hint or two that you will allow yourself to be guided by advisers that he trusts. It will set his mind at rest a bit."
Polgara looked around at them.
"The campaign is not likely to take us so far away that you won't be able to stay in touch with us. Not at first, anyway. If anything serious comes up, communicate with your husbands immediately. Deal with the day-to-day matters yourselves. I also think you should all stay in close contact with each other, once your husbands have left, and also with Porin in Boktor and Maya Serena in Vomimbre. You all have your strengths and your weaknesses, but if you are not afraid to seek advice from each other, everything will be all right."
"Possibly we should arrange for some kind of network for communications,"
Queen Layla mused thoughtfully.
"Relays of horses, messengers, fast ships, that sort of thing. The Tolnedrans have done that for centuries."
"I'm sure you will be able to arrange it, Layla."
Polgara smiled at her.
"The one thing you all must remember is to pay close attention to anything that Porin tells you. I know she's very young and a bit shy about putting herself forward, but Drasnian intelligence will report directly to her, and she will be aware of things long before any of the rest of you are. And I want you all to keep a particularly close watch on the Tolnedrans. They like to take advantage of periods of turmoil. Absolutely do not sign anything offered to you by a Tolnedran, no matter how attractive it may look. I trust Ranbarun about as much as I would trust a fox in a hen-house, and no offence intended, Sinedra." "I know my father too, Lady Polgara,"
Princess Sinedra replied with a smile.
"Please, ladies," Polgara told them firmly. "No adventures while I am gone. Just try to keep things running smoothly, and do not be afraid to consult with one another. You will also want to keep in touch with Xantha. The Dryads have access to a great deal of information about what's going on in the south. If any real emergency arises, get word to me immediately." "Will you want me to keep the little boy?" Merrill asked. "I'll be at Valarlorn with Aelina, so he will be safe with me. My girls are very fond of him, and he seems to be happy with us."
Polgara thought about it for a moment.
"No," she decided finally. "Aran's going to have to go with me. Aside from Geryon, he is the only person in the world who can touch the orb. The Angarax may realize that and try to take him." "I'll care for him,"
Taiba offered in her rich voice.
"He knows me, and we are comfortable with each other. It will give me something to do."
"Oh, surely you're not planning to go along on the campaign, Taiba?"
Queen Layla objected. Taiba shrugged.
"And why not?"
she replied.
"I don't have a house to keep or a kingdom to oversee. There are other reasons, too."
They all understood. What existed between Taiba and Relg was so profound that it seemed somehow outside the sphere of normal human attachments, and the Ulgo's absence had caused the strange woman something rather close to physical pain. It was now obvious that she intended to follow him. even into battle if necessary. Ariana, the blonde membrate girl who had accompanied Laldaran of Wildentor to Riva, cleared her throat in preparation to raising a matter of some delicacy.
"The lives of women are circumscribed by propriety," she noted. "Though battle doth rage about her, and rude war turneth all to confusion, a lady must not be unattended in the midst of an army, lest her reputation suffer. Lady Adara and I have of late held some conversation concerning this, and have concluded that we must accompany Princess Sinedra as her companions. We would do this out of duty, even were we not impelled by love." "Very nicely put, Ariana,"
Adara murmured without any hint of a smile.
"Oh, dear,"
Queen Layla sighed.
"Now I have 2 more to worry about."
"I think that covers everything, then," Polgara said. "Running a kingdom is not all that much different from running a house, and you have all had experience at that. Don't change any major policies, and do not sign any treaties. Aside from that, just let yourselves be guided by common sense. I think we can join the gentlemen now. It is getting on toward supper time, and men tend to grow restless if they are not fed regularly." A few days later, Barak returned to Riva, accompanied by a lean-faced Drasnian nobleman. The 2 of them immediately went to the council chamber to report to the kings. Princess Sinedra considered following them into the conference, but decided against it. Her presence might inhibit the discussion, and she had another way to find out what was going on. She retired quickly to her rooms and touched her fingertips to the amulet at her throat.
"Going fairly well,"
she heard Barak's voice say, after she had finally located the conversation she wished to hear.
"The fleet is ready to move out of Valalorn, and Queen Poren's got the Drasnian pikemen gathering just south of Boktor. The mobilization's very nearly complete. I think we've got some problems, though. Count Skerol here has just returned from Tulmordu. All the reports out of northern Khalmurgos have been channeled to him, so he can give us a fairly clear assessment of the situation there."
King Rodar cleared his throat.
"Kara is a very senior member of the intelligence service,"
he said by way of introduction.
"I have always found his reports to be extremely accurate."
"Your Majesty is too kind," an unfamiliar voice responded.
"Have the southern Murgos begun their march north?"
King An had asked. "It goes a bit farther than that, Your Majesty," Carol replied. "All reports I have indicate that the march is nearly completed. There are somewhat in excess of 4 million of them encamped in the vicinity of Rakgoska."
"What?"
Anheg exclaimed. "It appears that Taurogos began the march sometime last fall," the Drasnian told him.
"In the winter?"
"It seems so, Your Majesty." "I imagine that cost him a few of his men," King Hohag said. 100,000 or so, Your Majesty, Carol answered. "But human life does not mean that much to Taurogos."
"This changes everything, Rodar,"
Anheg said tersely.
"Our advantage has always been the time that march was going to take. We have lost that now."
"Unfortunately, there's more, Your Majesty," Carol continued. "The Western Malorians have begun to arrive at Turzelek. Their numbers aren't really that significant yet, but they are ferrying in several thousand a day."
"We've got to cut that off as quickly as we can," Anheg growled. "Rodar, can you get your engineers to the eastern escarpment within a month? I'm going to have to portage a fleet across to the headwaters of the River Mardu. We have got to get ships into the Sea of the East as soon as possible. If we do not head off Zakath, his Malorians will swarm us under."
"I'll send word to Poren immediately," Rodar agreed. "One wonders if the noble Count has any good news," the Earl of Selene suggested dryly. "There is some possibility
of division in the enemy ranks, my lord," Carol replied. "Tar Urgas is behaving as if he considered himself the only possible choice as Over-General of the Angrak armies. At the moment, he has got the advantage of numbers on his side. That may change if the Malorians manage to land a big enough army. There are rumors that Zachath would like to dispute the leadership of Tar Urgas, but he is reluctant to try it in the face of 4 million Murgos."
"Let's try to keep it that way," Rodar said. "Tar Urgas is insane, and crazy men make mistakes. I have heard about Zakath, and I would rather not face him in the field."
King Sohag spoke wryly.
"Even as it stands, without the Malorians, we are going to be taking the field at about a 2-to-1 disadvantage. And that is assuming that we can persuade the Arans and Tonedrans to join us."
"It's a rotten way to start a war, Rodar," Anheg complained.
"We'll just have to adjust our tactics," Rodar replied. "We have got to avoid a pitched battle as long as possible, to save as many men as we can." "I thought we were not even considering a battle," Barak objected. "And Belgarath said that all he wants is a diversion." "The situation has changed, Barak," King Rodar declared. "We had not counted on the southern Murgos, or the Malorians being in place this soon. We are going to have to do something a bit more significant than stage a few hit-and-run attacks. The Angraks have enough men now to be able to ignore minor raids and skirmishes. If we don't make a major thrust, and very soon, they will spread out all over the eastern half of the continent."
"Belgarath doesn't like it when you change plans on him," Anheg reminded Rodar.
"Belgarath isn't here, and he does not know what is going on. If we do not act rather decisively, he and Belgarian and Keldar haven't a hope of getting through."
"You're talking about a war that we cannot win, Rodar," Anheg said bluntly.
"I know,"
King Rodar admitted. There was a long silence.
"So, that's the way it is, then," Brand said finally. "I'm afraid so," Rodar told them somberly. "There has to be a diversion, or Belgarian and his sword will never get to the meeting with Torak. That's the only thing that really matters. And we all have to lay down our lives, if necessary, to make it happen."
"You're going to get us all killed, Rodar," Anheg said bluntly. "And all our armies with us."
"If that is what it takes, Anheg,"
Rodar answered grimly.
"If Belgarian does not get to Torak, our lives don't mean anything anyway. Even if we all have to die to get him there, it is still worth it."
Senedra's fingertips slid numbly from her amulet as she fell back in her chair. Suddenly she began to weep.
"I won't do it," she sobbed. "I can't."
She saw before her a multitude, an army of widows and orphans all staring accusingly at her, and she shrank from their eyes. If she perpetrated this horror, the rest of her life would be spent in an agony of self-loathing. Still weeping, she stumbled to her feet, fully intending to rush to the council chamber and declare that she would have nothing further to do with this futile war. But then she stopped, as the image of Gerion's face rose in her mind, that serious face with the unruly hair she always wanted to straighten. He depended on her. If she shrank from this, the Angraks would be free to hunt him down. His very life, and with it the future of the world, was in her hands. She had no choice but to continue. If only she did not know that the campaign was doomed. It was the knowledge of the disaster that awaited them that made it all so terrible. Knowing that it was useless, she began to tug at the chain that held the amulet about her neck,
Had it not been for the amulet, she would have remained blissfully ignorant of what lay ahead. Still sobbing, she yanked frantically at the chain, ignoring the sting as it cut into the soft skin of her neck.
"I hate you,"
she blurted irrationally at the silver amulet with its crowned tree. But it was useless. The medallion would remain chained about her neck for the rest of her life. Ashen-faced, Thinedra let her hands drop. Even if she were able to remove the amulet, what good would it do? She already knew, and she must conceal the knowledge in her heart. If the faintest hint of what she knew showed on her face or her voice, she would fail, and Geryon would suffer for her failure. She must steel herself and face the world as if certain of victory. And so it was that the Rivan Queen drew herself erect and bravely lifted her chin, even though her heart lay like lead in her breast. Chapter 25. Barak's new ship was larger by half than most of the other Carrack warboats in the fleet, but she moved before the spring breeze like a gull skimming low over the water. Fleecy white clouds ran across the blue sky, and the surface of the Sea of the Winds sparkled in the sunlight as the great ship heeled over and cut cleanly through the waves. Low on the horizon before them rose the green shoreline of the Hook of Arindia. They were 2 days out from Riva, and the Carrack fleet spread out behind them in a vast crowd of sails, carrying the grey-cloaked ravens to join the armies of King Fulrak of Cinderia. Thinedra nervously paced the deck near the prow, her blue cloak tossing in the wind and her armor gleaming. Despite the dreadful knowledge concealed in her heart, there was an excitement to all of this. The gathering of men, swords, and ships, the running before the wind, the sense of a unified purpose, all combined to make her blood race and to fill her with an exhilaration she had never felt before. The coast ahead loomed larger, a white sand beach backed by the dark green of the Arindish forest. As they neared the shoreline, an armored knight on a huge roan stallion emerged from the trees and rode down the beach to the edge of the water where foamy breakers crashed on the damp sand. The princess shaded her eyes with one hand and peered intently at the gleaming knight. Then, as he turned with a broad sweep of his arm, which told them to continue up the coast, she saw the crest on his shield. Her heart suddenly soared.
"Mandaralan!"
she cried out in a vibrant trumpet note as she clung to the ropes in the very prow of Barak's ship, with the wind whipping at her hair. The great knight waved a salute, and, spurring his charger, galloped through the seething foam at the edge of the beach, the silver and blue pennon at the tip of his lance snapping and streaming over his head. Their ship heeled over as Barak swung the tiller, and separated by 100 yards or so of foaming surf, the ship and the rider on the beach kept abreast of each other. It was a moment Thinedra would remember for all of her life, a single image so perfect that it seemed forever frozen in her memory. The great ship flew before the wind, cutting the sparkling blue water, with her white sails booming. The mighty war-horse on the beach plunged through the gleaming foam at the edge of the sand, with spray flying out from beneath his great hooves. Locked together in that endless moment, ship and rider raced along in the warm spring sunshine toward a wooded promontory a mile ahead, with Thinedra exulting in the ship's prow and her flaming hair streaming like a banner. Beyond the promontory lay a sheltered cove, and drawn up on the beach stood the camp of the Sindarian army, row upon orderly row of dun-colored tents. Barak swung his tiller over, and his sails flapped as the ship coasted into the cove, with the great Carrack fleet close behind. "Ho, Mandaralan!" Barak bellowed, as the anchor ropes sang and great iron anchors plunged down through the crystal-clear water toward the sandy bottom. "Ah, my lord Barak!" Mandaralan shouted his reply. "Welcome to Arindia. Lord Brendig hath advised there means to speed thy disembarking." He pointed to where 100 or so Sendarian soldiers were busily poling a series of large rafts into position, lashing them together to form a long floating wharf extending out into the waters of the cove. Barak laughed.
"Trust the Sendar to come up with something practical."
"Can we go ashore now?" King Rodar asked plaintively as he emerged from the cabin. The king was not a good sailor, and his broad, round face had a pale, greenish cast to it. He looked oddly comical in his mail shirt and helmet, and the ravages of seasickness on his face added little to his dignity. Despite his unwarlike exterior, however, the other kings had already begun to defer to his wisdom. Beneath his vast rotundity, Rodar concealed a genius for tactics, and a grasp of overall strategy that made the others turn to him almost automatically and accept his unspoken leadership. A small fishing boat had been pressed into service as a ferry drew alongside Barak's ship, almost before the anchors had settled, and the kings and their generals and advisers were transferred to the beach in less than half an hour.
"I think that I am hungry,"
Rodar announced the moment he stepped onto solid ground.
Anheg laughed. "I think that you were born hungry."
The king wore a mail shirt and had a broad sword belt about his waist. His coarse features seemed less out of place somehow now that he was armed.
"I haven't been able to eat for 2 days, Anheg," Rodar groaned. "My poor stomach is beginning to think that I have abandoned it."
"Food hath been prepared, your majesty," Mandaralan assured him. "Our Asturian brothers have provided goodly numbers of the king's deer, doubtless obtained lawfully, though I chose not to investigate that too closely." Someone standing in the group behind Mandaralan laughed, and Tenedra looked at the handsome young man with reddish-gold hair and the longbow slung over the shoulder of his green doublet. Tenedra had not had much opportunity to become acquainted with Laldaran of Wildentor while they had been at Reva. She knew him to be Gerion's closest friend, however, and she realized the importance of gaining his confidence. It should not be too hard, she decided as she looked at his open, almost innocent face. The gaze he returned was very direct, and one glance into those eyes told the princess that there was a vast sincerity and very little intelligence behind them.
"We have heard from Belgariad,"
Barak advised Mandaralan and the young Asturian.
"Where are they?"
Laldaran demanded eagerly.
"They were in Boktor,"
King Rodar replied, his face still a trifle green from his bout of seasickness.
"For reasons of her own, my wife let them pass through. I imagine they're somewhere in Gorognodrak by now."
Laldaran's eyes flashed.
"Maybe, if I hurry, I can catch up with them,"
he said eagerly, already starting to look around for his horse.
"It is 1,500 leagues, Laldaran,"
Barak pointed out politely.
"Oh,"
Laldaran seemed a bit crestfallen.
"I suppose you're right. It would be a little difficult to catch up with him now, wouldn't it?"
Barak nodded gravely.
And then the blonde membrate girl, Ariana, stepped forward, her heart in her eyes.
"My lord?"
she said to Laldaran, and Senedra remembered with a start that the two were married, technically at least.
"Thine absence hath given me great pain."
Laldaran's eyes were immediately stricken.
"Ah, my Ariana,"
he almost choked.
"I swear that I'll never leave you again."
He took both her hands in his and gazed adoringly into her eyes. The gaze she returned was just as full of love and just as empty of thought. Tenedra shuddered inwardly at the potential for disaster implicit in the look the two exchanged.
"Does anyone care that I'm starving to death right here on this spot?" Rodar asked.
The banquet was laid on a long table set up beneath a gaily striped pavilion on the beach, not far from the edge of the forest. The table, quite literally, groaned under its weight of roasted game, and there was enough to eat to satisfy even the enormous appetite of King Rodar. When they had finished eating, They lingered at the table in conversation. "Thy son, Lord Hithar, has advised us that the Elgar clans are gathering at the stronghold, your majesty," Mandaralan reported to King Kohag. Kohag nodded. "And we have had word from the Ulgo Relg," Colonel Brendig added. "He has gathered a small army of warriors from the caves. They will wait for us on the Algarian side of the mountains. He said that you would know the place." Barak grunted. "The Ulgos can be troublesome. They are afraid of open places, and daylight hurts their eyes. But they can see in the dark like cats. They could be very useful at some point."
"Did Relg send any personal messages?"
Taiba asked Brendig with a little catch in her voice. Gravely, the Sindar took a folded parchment from inside his tunic and handed it to her. She took it with a rather helpless expression and opened it, turning it this way and that.
"What is the matter, Taiba?"
Adara asked quietly.
"He knows that I cannot read,"
Taiba protested, holding the note tightly pressed against her.
"I will read it to you,"
Adara offered.
"But maybe it is, well, personal,"
Taiba objected.
"I promise I won't listen,"
Adara told her without a trace of a smile. Tinedra covered her own smile with her hand. Adara's penetrating and absolutely straight-faced wit was one of the qualities that most endeared her to the princess. Even as she smiled, however, Tinedra could feel eyes on her, and she knew that she was being examined with great curiosity by the Arrens, both Asturian and Mimbrate, who had joined them. Luldaran, in particular, seemed unable to take his eyes from her. The handsome young man sat close beside the blonde Mimbrate girl, Ariana, and stared openly at Tinedra, even while, unconsciously perhaps, he held Ariana's hand. Tinedra endured his scrutiny with a certain nervousness. To her surprise, she found that she wanted this rather foolish young man's approval.
"Tell me," she said directly to him, "what are the sentiments here in Asturia? Concerning our campaign, I mean?"
Luldaran's eyes clouded.
"Unenthusiastic, for the most part, your majesty. I am afraid there is suspicion that this might all be some Mimbrate plot. But that is absurd," Tinedra declared.
Luldaran shrugged.
"It is the way of my countrymen, the way they think, and those who do not think it is a plot are looking at the idea that all of the Mimbrite knights might join a crusade against the East. That raises certain hopes in some quarters."
Mandaralan sighed. "The same sentiments exist in some parts of Mimbra. We are a woefully divided kingdom, and old hatreds and suspicions die hard."
Tinedra felt a sudden wave of consternation.
She had not counted on this. King Rodar had made it plain that he absolutely had to have the Arrens, and now the idiotic hatred and suspicion between Mimbra and Asturia seemed about to bring the entire plan crashing down around her ears. Helplessly, she turned to Polgara. The sorceress, however, seemed undisturbed by the news that the Arrens were reluctant to join the campaign.
"Tell me, Leldaran," she said calmly, "could you gather some of your less suspicious friends in one place, some secure place where they won't be afraid we might want to ambush them?"
"What have you got in mind, Polgara?" King Rodar asked, his eyes puzzled.
"Someone's going to have to talk to them," Polgara replied. "Someone rather special, I think." She turned back to Leldaran. "I don't think we'll want a large crowd. Oh, not at first, anyway. 40 or 50 ought to be enough, and no one too violently opposed to our cause." "I will gather them at once, Lady Polgara," Leldaran declared, impulsively leaping to his feet. "It is rather late, Leldaran," she pointed out, glancing at the sun hovering low over the horizon. "The sooner I start, the sooner I can gather them," Leldaran said fervently. If friendship and the ties of blood have any sway at all, I will not fail."
He bowed deeply to Senedra.
"Your Majesty,"
he said by way of farewell, and ran to where his horse was tethered. Ariana sighed as she looked after the departing young enthusiast.
"Is he always like that?"
Senedra asked her curiously. The membrate girl nodded.
"Always,"
she admitted.
"Thought and deed are simultaneous with him. He hath no understanding of the meaning of the word reflection, I fear. It doth add to his charm, but it is sometimes disconcerting, I must admit." I can imagine,"
Senedra agreed. Later, when the princess and Polgara were alone in their tent, Senedra turned a puzzled look upon Garion's aunt.
"What are we going to do?"
"Not we, Senedra. You are going to have to talk with them."
"I am not very good at speaking in public, Lady Belgariad,"
Senedra confessed, her mouth going dry.
"Crowds frighten me, and I get all tongue-tied."
"You will get over it, dear," Polgara assured her. She looked at the princess with a slightly amused expression. "You are the one who wanted to lead an army, remember? Did you really think that all you were going to have to do was to put on your armor, jump into the saddle, and shout, 'Follow me,' and then the whole world would fall in behind you?"
"Well—"
"You spent all that time studying history, and missed the one thing all great leaders have had in common. You must have been very inattentive, Senedra." Senedra stared at her with a slowly dawning horror. "It doesn't take that much to raise an army, dear. You don't have to be brilliant. You don't have to be a warrior. Your cause doesn't even have to be great and noble. All you have to do is to be eloquent."
"I cannot do that, Lady Belgariad."
"You should have thought of that before, Senedra. It is too late to go back now. Rodar will command the army and see to it that all of the details are taken care of, but you are the one who will have to make them want to follow you."
"I would not have the faintest idea what to say to them,"
Senedra protested. "It will come to you, dear. You do believe in what you're doing, don't you?"
"Well, of course, but—"
"You decided to do this, Senedra. You decided it all by yourself. And as long as you have come this far, you might as well go all of the way."
"Please, Lady Belgariad,"
Senedra begged.
"Speaking in public makes me sick at my stomach. I will throw up."
"That happens now and then," Polgara observed calmly. "Just try not to do it in front of everybody." 3 days later, the princess, Polgara, and the Alorn kings journeyed to the ruined city of Voaster, deep in the silences of the Arindish forest. Senedra rode through the sunny woods in a state hovering on the verge of panic. In spite of all of her arguments, Polgara had remained adamant. Tears had not budged her. Hysterics had failed. The princess was morbidly convinced that even if she were to die, Polgara would prop her up in front of the waiting throng and make her go through the agony of addressing them. Feeling absolutely helpless, she rode to meet her fate. Like Voachun, Voaster had been laid waste during the dark centuries of the Arindish Civil War. Its tumbled stones were green with moss, and they lay in the shade of vast trees that seemed to mourn the honor, pride, and sorrow of Asturia. Luldaran was waiting, and with him were perhaps 50 richly dressed young noblemen, their eyes filled with curiosity, faintly tinged with suspicion.
"It is as many as I could bring together in a short time, Lady Belgariad,"
Luldaran apologized after they had dismounted.
"There are others in the region, but they are convinced that our campaign is some kind of membrane treachery."
"These will do nicely, Luldaran. They'll spread the word about what happens here." She looked around at the mossy, sun-dappled ruins. "I think that spot over there will be fine." She pointed at a broken bit of one of the walls. "Come with me, Senedra." The princess, dressed in her armor, hung her helmet and shield on the saddle of the white horse King Chohag had brought for her from Algaria, and led the patient animal as she tremblingly followed the sorceress. "We want them to be able to see you, dear, as well as to hear you. So climb up on that piece of wall and speak from there. The spot where you will be standing is in the shade now, but the sun's moving around so that it will be fully on you as you finish your speech. I think that will be a nice touch." Tinedra quailed as she saw how far the sun had to go.
"I think I'm going to be sick,"
she said in a quivering little voice. Maybe later, Tinedra. You don't have time just now." Polgara turned to Luldarin. "I think you can introduce Her Majesty now." Luldarin stepped onto the wall and held up his hand for silence. "Countrymen," he announced in a loud voice, "last Eristide, an event took place which shook our world to its foundations. For 1,000 years and more we have awaited that moment. My countrymen, the Raven King has returned!" The throng stirred at his announcement, and an excited buzz rippled through it. Luldarin, always extravagant, warmed to his subject. He told them of the flaming sword that had announced Gerion's true identity, and one of the oaths of fealty sworn to Belgariad of Riva by the Alorn kings. Tinedra, almost fainting with nervousness, scarcely heard him. She tried to run over her speech in her mind, but it all kept getting jumbled. Then, in a near panic, she heard him say, "Countrymen, I present to you Her Imperial Highness, Princess Tinedra, the Rivan Queen." And all eyes turned expectantly to her. Trembling in every limb, she mounted the broken wall and looked at the faces spread out before her. All her preparations, all of the rehearsed phrases, evaporated from her mind. And she stood, white-faced and shaking, without the faintest idea of how to begin. The silence was dreadful. As chance had it, one of the young Asturians in the very front had tasted perhaps more wine that morning than was good for him. "I think Her Majesty has forgotten her speech," he snickered loudly to one of his companions. Tinedra's reaction was instantaneous.
"And I think the gentleman has forgotten his manners,"
she flared, not even stopping to think. Incivility infuriated her.
"I don't think I'm going to listen to this,"
the tipsy young man declared, in a tone filled with exaggerated boredom.
"It is just a waste of time. I am not Raven, and neither are any of the rest of you. What could a foreign queen possibly say that would be of any interest to Asturian patriots?"
And he started to turn away.
"Is the patriotic Asturian gentleman so wine-soaked that he has forgotten that there is more to the world than this forest?"
Tinedra retorted hotly.
"Or perhaps he is so unschooled that he does not know what is happening out there?"
She leveled a threatening finger at him.
"Hear me, patriot,"
she said in a ringing voice.
"You may think that I am just here to make some pretty little speech, but what I have come to say to you is the most important thing you will ever hear. You can listen, or you can turn your back and walk away. And a year from now, when there is no Asturia, and when your homes are smoking in ruins, and the Grolums are herding your families to the altar of Torak with its fire and its bloody knives, you can look back on this day and curse yourself for not listening."
And then, as if her anger with this one rude young man had suddenly burst a dam within her, Tinedra began to speak. She spoke to them directly, not with studied phrases like she had rehearsed, but with words that came from her heart. The longer she spoke, the more impassioned she became. She pleaded, she cajoled, and finally she commanded. She would never remember exactly what it was she had said, but she would never forget how she felt as she said it. All the passion and fire that had filled the stormy outbursts and tantrums of her girlhood came into full play. She spoke fervently, with no thought of herself, but rather with an all-consuming belief in what she said. In the end, she won them over. As the sun fell full upon her, her armor gleamed, and her hair seemed to leap into flame.
"Belgariad, King of Riva and Overlord of the West, calls you to war," she declared to them. "I am Tsinedra, his queen, and I stand before you as a living banner. Who among you will answer Belgariad's call and follow me?"
It was the young man who had laughed at her, whose sword leaped first into his hand. Raising it in salute, he shouted, "I will follow." As if his declaration were a signal, 100 swords flashed in the sunlight as they were raised in salute and pledge, and 100 voices echoed his shout, "I will follow." With a broad sweep of her arm, Tsinedra drew her own sword and lifted it.
"Follow, then," she sang to them. "We ride to meet the fell hordes of Angarak. Let the world tremble at our coming."
With 3 quick steps she reached her horse and literally threw herself into the saddle. She wheeled her prancing mount and galloped from the ruins, her sword aloft and her flaming hair streaming behind her. The Asturians, as one man, rushed to their horses to follow. As she plunged into the forest, the princess glanced back once at the brave, foolish young men galloping behind her, their faces exalted. She had won. But how many of these unthinking Asturians would she lead back when the war was done? How many would die in the wastes of the East? Her eyes suddenly filled with tears. But, dashing those tears away with one hand, the Rivan Queen galloped on, leading the Asturians back to join her army. Chapter 26. The Elorn kings praised Tsinedra extravagantly, and hard-bitten warriors looked at her with open admiration. She lapped up their adulation and purred like a happy little kitten. The only thing that kept her triumph from being complete was Polgara's strange silence. Tsinedra was a little hurt by that. The speech had not been perfect, perhaps, but it had won Loldoran's friends completely, and surely success made up for minor flaws. Then, when Polgara sent for her that evening, Tsinedra thought she understood. The sorceress wished to congratulate her in private. Humming happily to herself, the princess went along the beach to Polgara's tent with the sound of waves on the white sand in her ears. Polgara sat at her dressing table, alone except for the sleepy child, Errand. The candlelight played softly over her deep blue robe, and the perfection of her features as she brushed her long, dark hair. "Come in, Tsinedra. Sit down. We have a great deal to discuss."
"Were you surprised, Lady Polgara?"
The princess could no longer contain herself.
"You were, weren't you? I even surprised myself."
Polgara looked at her gravely.
"You mustn't allow yourself to become so excited, Tsinedra. You have to learn to conserve your strength, and not squander it by dashing about in hysterical self-congratulation."
Tsinedra stared at her.
"Don't you think I did well today?"
she asked, hurt to the quick.
"It was a very nice speech, Tsinedra,"
Polgara told her in a way that took all of the fun out of it. A strange thought occurred to the princess then.
"You knew, didn't you? You knew all along."
A faint flicker of amusement touched Polgara's lips.
"You always seem to forget that I have certain advantages, dear," she replied. "And one of those is that I have a general idea of how things are going to turn out." "How could you possibly?" "Certain events don't just happen, Tsinedra. Some things have been implicit in this world since the moment it was made. What happened today was one of those things." She reached over and picked up an age-darkened scroll from the table. "Would you like to hear what the prophecy says about you?"
Tsinedra felt a sudden chill. Polgara ran her eyes down the crackling parchment.
Here it is," she said, lifting the scroll into the candlelight. "And the voice of the Bride of Light shall be heard in the kingdoms of the world, and her words shall be as a fire in dry grass, that the multitude shall rise up to go forth under the blaze of her banner." "But that doesn't mean anything at all, Lady Polgara. It's absolute gibberish," Tsinedra objected. Does it become any clearer when you find out that Geryon is the child of light?" "What is that?" Sinedra demanded, staring at the parchment. "Where did you get it?" "It is the Mrin Codex, dear. My father copied it for me from the original. It is a bit obscure because the Mrin prophet was so hopelessly insane that he could not speak coherently. King Dras Bullneck finally had to keep him chained to a post like a dog." "King Dras? Lady Belgariad, that was over 3,000 years ago."
About that long, yes," Belgariad agreed. Sinedra began to tremble.
"That is impossible," she blurted.
Belgariad smiled.
"Sometimes, Sinedra, you sound exactly like Geryon. I wonder why young people are so fond of that word." "But, Lady Belgariad, if it had not been for that young man who was so insulting, I might not have said anything at all."
The princess bit her lip. She had not meant to confess that.
"That's probably why he was so insulting, then. It's quite possible that insulting you at that particular moment was the only reason he was born in the first place. The prophecy leaves nothing to chance, dear. Do you think you might need him to help you get started next time? I can arrange to have him get drunk again if you do." "Next time? But of course. Did you think that one speech to a very small audience was going to be the end of it? Really, Sinedra, you have to learn to pay more attention to what's going on. You are going to have to speak in public at least once a day for the next several months."
The princess stared at her in horror.
"I can't," she wailed. "Yes, you can, Sinedra. Your voice will be heard in the land, and your words shall be as a fire in dry grass, and the multitudes of the West shall rise up to follow your banner. Down through all the centuries, I have never known the Mrin Codex to be wrong. Not once. The important thing at the moment is for you to get plenty of rest and to eat regularly. I will prepare your meals myself." She looked rather critically at the tiny girl. "It would help if you were a bit more robust. Oh, but I guess we'll have to make do with what we have. Go get your things, Sinedra. From now on, you will be staying with me. I think I'm going to want to keep an eye on you."
In the weeks that followed, they moved down through the moist green Arendish forest, and word of their coming spread throughout Asturia. Sinedra was dimly aware that Belgariad was carefully controlling the size and composition of the audiences to be addressed. Poor Loldaran was seldom out of his saddle as he and a carefully selected group of his friends ranged ahead of the advancing army to prepare each gathering. Sinedra, once she had finally accepted her duty, had assumed that speaking in public would grow easier with practice. Unfortunately, she was wrong. Panic still gripped her before each speech, and quite frequently she was physically sick. Although Belgariad assured her that her speeches were getting better, Sinedra complained that they were not getting easier. The drain on her physical and emotional reserves became more and more evident. Like most girls her age, Sinedra could and often did talk endlessly, but her orations were not random talk. They required an enormous control and a tremendous expenditure of emotional energy, and no one could help her. As the crowds grew larger, however, Belgariad did provide some aid in a purely technical matter.
"Just speak in a normal tone of voice, Sinedra," she instructed. "Don't exhaust yourself by trying to shout. I will see to it that everybody can hear you."
Aside from that, however, the princess was on her own, and the strain became more and more visible. She rode listlessly at the head of her growing army, seeming sometimes almost to be in a trance. Her friends watched her and worried.
"I'm not sure how much longer she can keep up this pace,"
King Folrak confided to King Rodar, as they rode directly behind the drooping little queen toward the ruins of Voachun, where she was to address yet another gathering.
"I think we tend sometimes to forget how small and delicate she is."
"Maybe we had better consult with Belgariad," King Rodar agreed. "I think the child needs a week to rest." Tinedra, however, knew that she could not stop. There was a momentum to this, a kind of accelerating rhythm that could not be broken. At first, word of her coming had spread slowly, but now it ran ahead of them, and she knew they must run faster and faster to keep up with it. There was a crucial point at which the curiosity about her must be satisfied, or the whole thing would collapse and she would have to begin all over again. The crowd at Voachun was the largest she had yet addressed. Half convinced already, they needed only a single spark to ignite them. Once again sick with unreasoning panic, the Rivan Queen gathered her strength and rose to address them, and to set them aflame with her call to war. When it was over, and the young nobles had been gathered into the growing ranks of the army, Tinedra sought a few moments of solitude on the outskirts of the camp to compose herself. This had become a kind of necessary ritual for her. Sometimes she was sick after a speech, and sometimes she wept. Sometimes she merely wandered listlessly, not even seeing the trees about her. At Polgara's instruction, Dernick always accompanied her, and Tinedra found the company of this solid, practical man strangely comforting. They had walked some distance from the ruins. The afternoon was bright and sunny, and birds were singing among the trees. Pensively, Tinedra walked, letting the peace of the forest quiet the agitated turmoil within her. "It's all very well for noblemen, Detton," she heard someone say somewhere on the other side of a thicket. "But what does it have to do with us?" "You'd probably right, Laymer," a second voice agreed with a regretful sigh. "It was very stirring, though, wasn't it?" "The only thing that ought to be a stirring thing to a serf is the sight of something to eat. The little girl can talk all she wants about duty. My only duty is to my stomach." He stopped abruptly. "Are the leaves of that plant over there fit to eat?" "I think they are poisonous, Lammer," Detton replied. "But you are not sure? I would hate to pass up something that I could eat if there was any chance that it would not kill me." Tinedra listened to the two serfs with growing horror. Could anybody be reduced to that level? Impulsively, she stepped around the thicket to confront them. Dernick, as always, stayed close by her side. The two serfs were dressed in mud-spattered rags. They were both men of middle years, and there was no evidence on their faces that either of them had ever known a happy day. The leaner of the two was closely examining a thick-leafed weed, but the other saw Tinedra approaching and started with obvious fright. "La Mère," he gasped. "It is her, the one who spoke today." La Mère straightened, his gaunt face going pale beneath the dirt that smudged it. Your ladyship," he said, grotesquely trying to bow. "We were just on our way back to our villages. We didn't know this part of the forest was yours. We didn't take anything." He held out his empty hands as if to prove his words. "How long has it been since you have had anything to eat?" "Oh, well, I ate some grass this morning, your ladyship. And I had a couple of turnips yesterday. Yes, they were a little wormy, but not so bad." Tinedra's eyes suddenly filled with tears. "Who has done this to you?" Lemmer looked a little confused at her question. Finally, he shrugged slightly. "The world, I guess, your ladyship. A certain part of what we raise goes to our Lord, and a certain part to his Lord. And then there is the part that has to go to the king, and the part that has to go to the royal governor, and we're still paying for some wars my lord had a few years ago. After all of that has been paid, well, there's not very much left for us." A horrible thought struck her. "I'm gathering an army for a campaign in the east," she told them. "Yes, your ladyship," the other serf replied. "We heard your speech today." "What will you two do?" Detton shrugged. "It will mean more taxes, your ladyship. And some of our sons will be taken for soldiers, if our lords decide to join you. Serfs don't really make very good soldiers,
But they can always carry the baggage, and when the time comes to storm my castle, the nobility seem to want to have a lot of serfs around to help with the dying.
Then you never feel any patriotism when you go to war?
What could patriotism have to do with serfs, my lady? Until a month or so ago, I didn't even know the name of my country. None of it belongs to me. Why should I have any feelings about it?
Tinedra could not answer that question. Their lives were so bleak, so hopelessly empty, and her call to war meant only greater hardship and more suffering for them.
What about your families? If Torak wins, the Grolums will come and slaughter your families on his altars.
I have no family, my lady, Emma replied in a dead voice. My son died several years ago. My lord was fighting a war somewhere, and when they attacked a castle, the people inside poured boiling pitch down on the serfs who were trying to raise a ladder. My wife starved herself to death after she heard about it. The Grolums cannot hurt either one of them now. And if they want to kill me, they are welcome to.
Isn't there anything at all that you would be willing to fight for?
Food, I suppose, Limmer said after a moment's thought. I am very tired of being hungry.
Tinedra turned to the other serf.
What about you?
I'd walk into a fire for somebody who would feed me, Detton replied fervently.
Come with me,
Tinedra commanded them, and she turned and led the way back to the camp and the large, bulky supply wagons that had transported the vast quantities of food from the storehouses of Sindaria.
I want these 2 men fed, she told a startled cook, as much as they can eat.
Dernek, however, his honest eyes brimming with compassion, had already reached into one of the wagons and taken out a large loaf of bread. He tore it in two and gave half to Lemer and half to Detton. Lemer stared at the chunk of bread in his hands, trembling violently.
I will follow you, my lady,
he declared in a quavering voice.
I have eaten my shoes, lived on boiled grass and tree roots.
His fists closed about the chunk of bread, as if he were afraid someone might take it away from him.
I will follow you to the end of the world and back for this.
And he began to eat, tearing at the bread with his teeth. Tinedra stared at him and then suddenly fled. By the time she reached her tent, she was weeping hysterically. Edera and Taiba tried without success to comfort her, and finally they sent for Polgara. When the sorceress arrived, she took one brief look and asked Taiba and Edera to leave her alone with the sobbing girl.
"All right, Sinedra," she said calmly, sitting on the bed and gathering the princess in her arms. "What is this all about?" "I cannot do this any more, Lady Polgara. I just can't." "It was your idea in the first place," Polgara reminded her. "I was wrong. I should have stayed in Riva." "No, you have done something that none of the rest of us could have. You have guaranteed us the errands. I'm not even sure that Geryon could have done that." "But they're all going to die." "Now where did you get that idea?" "The Engraks are going to outnumber us at least 2-1. They'll butcher my army." "Who told you that?" I listened," Sinedra replied, fumbling with the amulet at her throat. "I heard what Rotar, Anheg, and the others said when they heard about the southern Murkos." "I see," Polgara said gravely. "We are going to throw away our lives. Nothing could save us. And just now I even found a way to bring the serfs into it. Their lives are so miserable that they'll follow me just for a chance to eat regularly. And I will do it, Lady Polgara. If I think I might need them, I will deliberately take them from their homes and lead them to death. I can't help myself." Polgara took a glass from a nearby table and emptied a small glass vial into it. "The war is not over yet, Sinedra. It has not even begun."
She swirled the dark amber liquid around in the bottom of the glass. "I have seen hopeless wars won before. If you give in to despair before you begin, you will have no chance at all. Rodar's a very clever tactician, you know, and the men in your army are very brave. We won't commit to any battle until we absolutely have to, and if Geryon can reach Torek in time, and if he wins, the Angaraks will fall apart and we won't have to fight them at all. Here," she held out the glass, "drink this." Numbly, Tinedra took the glass and drank. The amber liquid was bitter, and it left a strange, fiery aftertaste in her mouth.
"It all depends on Geryon, then."
"It has always depended on him, dear." Tinedra sighed.
"I wish—"
she began, then faltered to a stop.
"Wish what, dear?" "Oh, Lady Bulgara, I never once told Geryon that I love him. I would give anything to be able to tell him that, just once."
"He knows, Tinedra."
"But that's not the same."
Tinedra sighed again. A strange lassitude had begun to creep over her, and she had stopped crying. It was difficult somehow even to remember why she had been weeping. She suddenly felt eyes on her, and turned. Aaron sat quietly in the corner, watching her. His deep blue eyes were filled with sympathy, and, oddly, with hope. And then Polgara took the princess in her arms and began rocking slowly back and forth, humming a soothing kind of melody. Without knowing when it happened, Tinedra fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The attempt on her life came the following morning. Her army was marching south from Voachun, passing through the sunlit forest along the Great West Road. The princess was riding at the head of the column, talking with Barak and Mandaralan, when an arrow, buzzing spitefully, came out of the trees. It was the buzz that gave Barak an instant of warning. "Look out!" he shouted, suddenly covering Tinedra with his great shield. The arrow shattered against it, and Barak, cursing horribly, drew his sword. Bran's youngest son, Olban, however, was already plunging at a dead run into the forest. His face had gone deathly pale, and his sword seemed to leap into his hands as he spun his horse. The sound of the galloping mount faded back among the trees. After several moments, there was a dreadful scream. Shouts of alarm came from the army behind them, and a confused babble of voices. Polgara rode forward, her face white.
"I am all right, Lady Bulgara,"
Tinedra assured her quickly.
"Barak saved me."
"What happened?" Polgara demanded.
"Someone shot an arrow at her. If I hadn't heard it buzz, it might have been very bad."
Valderan had picked up the shattered arrow shaft and was looking at it closely.
"The fletching is loose,"
he said, rubbing his finger over the feathers.
"That's what made it buzz like that."
Olban came riding back out of the forest, his bloody sword still in his hand.
"Is the queen safe?"
he demanded. For some reason his voice seemed on the verge of hysteria.
"She's fine,"
Barak said, looking at him curiously.
"Who was it?"
"A Murgo, I think. He had scars on his cheeks."
"Did you kill him?"
Olban nodded.
"Are you sure you're all right, my queen?"
he asked Tinedra. His pale blonde hair was tousled, and he seemed very young and very earnest.
"I'm just fine, Olban," she replied. "You were very brave, but you should have waited instead of riding off alone like that. There might have been more than one."
"Then I would have killed them all," Olban declared fiercely. "I will destroy anyone who even raises a finger against you." The young man was actually trembling with rage.
"That dedication becomes the young Rivan,"
Mandaralan told him.
"I think we had better put out some scouts," Barak suggested to King Rodar. "At least until we get out of these trees. Korodulan was going to chase all of the Murgos out of Erendia, but it looks as if he missed a few."
"Let me lead the scouting parties,"
Olban begged.
"Your son has a great deal of enthusiasm,"
Rodar observed to Bran.
"I like that in a young man."
He turned back to Olban.
"All right. Take as many men as you need.
I don't want any Murgles within 5 miles of the princess.
You have my word on it, Volbin declared, wheeling his horse and plunging back into the forest. They rode a bit more cautiously after that, and archers were placed strategically to watch the crowd when Tinedra spoke. Olban rather grimly reported that a few more Murgles had been flushed out of the trees ahead of them, but there were no further incidents. It was very nearly the first day of summer when they rode out of the forest onto the central Arendish plain. Tinedra, by that time, had gathered nearly every able-bodied Asturian into her army, and her hosts spread out behind her in a sea of humanity as she led the way out onto the plain. The sky above was very blue as they left the trees behind, and the grass was very green beneath the hoofs of their horses.
"And where now, your majesty?" Mandaralin inquired.
To Vomembre,
Tinedra replied.
I will speak to the Membrate knights, and then we will go on to Tonedra.
I hope your father still loves you, Tinedra. It will take a lot of love to make Ranborun forgive you for entering Tonedra with this army at your back.
He adores me,
Tinedra assured him confidently. King Rodar still looked dubious. The army marched down through the plains of central Arindia toward the capital at Vomembre, where King Coradulan had assembled the Membrate knights and their retainers. The weather continued fair, and they marched in bright sunshine. One sunny morning, shortly after they had set out, Lady Polgara rode forward and joined Tinedra at the head of the column. "Have you decided how you are going to deal with your father yet?"
I'm not sure. He is probably going to be extremely difficult.
The Baroons usually are.
I am a Baroon, Lady Polgara.
I know. Polgara looked penetratingly at the princess. You have grown considerably in the past few months, dear, she observed.
I didn't really have much choice, Lady Polgara. Isolde came on rather suddenly.
Tinedra giggled then as a thought suddenly struck her.
Poor Garion,
she laughed. Why poor Garion?
I was horrid to him, wasn't I?
Moderately horrid, yes.
How were any of you able to stand me?
We clenched our teeth frequently.
Do you think he will be proud of me? If he knows what I am doing, I mean?
Yes, I think he would be.
I'm going to make it all up to him, you know. I'm going to be the best wife in the world.
That's nice, dear.
I won't scold or shout or anything.
Don't make promises you can't keep, Tinedra, Polgara said wisely.
Well,
the little princess amended.
Almost never, anyway.
Polgara smiled. We'll see. The Membrate knights were encamped on the great plain before the city of Vomembre. Together with their men-at-arms, they comprised a formidable army, glittering in the sunlight.
Oh, dear,
Tinedra faltered as she stared down at the vast gathering from the hilltop where she and the Elorn kings had ridden to catch the glimpse of the city.
What's the problem?
Rodar asked her.
There are so many of them.
That's the whole idea, isn't it?
A tall Membrate knight with dark hair and beard, wearing a black velvet surcoat over his polished armor, galloped up the hill and reined in some yards before them. He looked from face to face, then inclined his head in a polite bow. He turned to Mandaralin.
Greetings to the bastard of Volmandor from Coradulan, King of Orindia. You still haven't gotten that straightened out, have you? Barak muttered to Mandaralin. I have had not the leisure, my lord, Mandaralin replied. He turned to the knight. Hail and well met, Sir Andaric. I pray thee, convey our greetings to his majesty, and advise him that we come in peace, which he doubtless doth know already. I will, Sir Mandaralin, Andaric responded. Who's your apple tree doing, Andaric? Barak asked, grinning openly. It doth flourish, my lord of Trelheim, Andaric answered proudly. My care for it has been most tender, and I have hopes of a bounteous harvest.
I am confident that I have not disappointed holy Belgarath." He turned and clattered back down the hill, sounding his horn every 100 yards or so. "What was that all about?" King Onheg asked his red-bearded cousin with a puzzled frown. "We've been here before," Barak replied. "Andrig didn't believe us when we told him who Belgarath was. Belgarath made an apple tree grow up out of the stones of the courtyard, and that sort of convinced him." "I prythee," Mandaralan said then, his eyes clouded with a sudden pain, "I see the approach of dear friends. I shall return presently." He moved his horse at a canter toward a knight and a lady who were riding out from the city. "Good man there," Rodar mused, watching the great knight as he departed. "But why do I get the feeling that when I'm talking to him, my words are bouncing off solid bone?"
"Mandaralan is my knight." Tinedra quickly came to the defense of her champion. "He does not need to think. I will do his thinking for him."
She stopped suddenly.
"Oh, dear. That sounds dreadful, doesn't it?"
King Rodar laughed. "You are a treasure, Tinedra," he said fondly. "But you do tend to blurt things out on occasion."
"Who are those people?"
Tinedra asked, curiously watching as Mandaralan rode to meet the couple who had emerged from the gates of Bomembre. "That's the Baron of Oebor," Dernick replied quietly, "and his wife, the Baroness Nirna. Mandaralan's in love with her."
"What?"
"Oh, it's all very proper," Dernick assured her quickly. "I didn't understand it at first myself. But I guess it's the sort of thing that happens here in Arindia. Oh, it's a tragedy, of course. All three of them are suffering terribly." The good man sighed then.
"Oh, dear,"
Tinedra said, biting her lip.
"I didn't know. And I've treated him so badly at times."
"I'm sure he'll forgive you, Princess," Dernick told her. "He has a very great heart." A short time later, King Coradulan rode out from the city accompanied by Mandaralan and a score of armored knights. Tinedra had met the young king of Arindia several years before, and she remembered him as a pale, thin young man with a beautiful voice. On this occasion he was dressed in full armor and a crimson surcoat. He raised his visor as he approached. "Ah, your Majesty," he greeted her gravely. "We have awaited thy coming with great anticipation."
"Your Majesty is too kind,"
Tinedra replied. "We have marveled at the stories of thy mobilization of our Asturian cousins," the king told her. "Thine oratory must be wondrously persuasive to move them to lay aside their customary enmities." "The day wears on, your Majesty," King Rodar observed. "Her Majesty would like to address your knights, with your permission, of course. Once you have heard her, I think you will understand her value to our cause." "At once, your Majesty," Coradulan agreed. He turned to one of his men. "Assemble the knights and the men-at-arms of Mimbre, that the Rivan Queen may disclose her mind to them," he commanded. The army, which had followed Tinedra down through the plains of Arindia, had begun to arrive and was flowing down onto the plain before the city in a vast multitude. Drawn up to meet that force stood the glittering Mimbrite knights. The air crackled with suspicion as the two groups eyed each other. "I think that we had better move right along," King Chohag suggested. "An accidental remark out there could precipitate some unpleasantness that we would all prefer to avoid." Tinedra had already begun to feel sick to her stomach. The feeling by now, however, was so familiar that it no longer even worried her. A platform had been erected on a spot that stood midway between Tinedra's army and the armored knights of King Coradulan. The princess, accompanied by all of her friends and the Mimbrate honor guard, rode down to the platform where she nervously dismounted. "Feel free to speak at length, Tinedra," Lady Polgara quietly advised. "Mimbrates dote on ceremony, and they are as patient as stones if you give them something formal to watch. It is about 2 hours until sunset. Try to climax the speech to coincide with that."
Tynedra gasped.
2 hours?
"If you need longer, we could build bonfires," Durnick offered helpfully.
2 hours ought to be about right, Lady Polgara surmised. Tynedra quickly began mentally revising her speech.
"You will make sure that they can all hear me?"
she asked Polgara.
"I'll take care of it, dear."
Tynedra drew in a deep breath.
"All right, then. Here we go."
And she was helped up onto the platform. It was not pleasant. It never was. But her weeks of practice in northern Orindia had given her the ability to assess the mood of a crowd and to adjust the pace of her delivery accordingly. As Polgara had suggested, the Membrates seemed quite willing to listen interminably. Moreover, standing here on the field at Valmembre gave her words a certain dramatic impact. Torak himself had stood here, and the vast human sea of the Angarak hordes had hurled themselves from here against the unyielding walls of the city gleaming at the edge of the plain. Tynedra spoke, the words rolling from her mouth as she delivered her impassioned address. Every eye was upon her, and every ear was bent to her words. Whatever sorcery Lady Polgara used to make the Rivan Queen's voice audible at the farthest edge of the crowd was clearly working. Tynedra could see the impact of what she was saying rippling through the hosts before her, like a breeze touching a field of bending wheat. And then, as the sun hovered in a golden cloud just above the western horizon, the little queen moved into the climatic crescendo of her oration. The words pride, honor, courage, and duty sang in the blood of her rapt listeners. Her final question,
"Who will follow me?"
was delivered just as the setting sun bathed the field with flaming light, and was answered with an ear-splitting roar as the Membrate knights drew their swords in salute. Perspiring heavily in her sun-heated armor, Tynedra, as was her custom, drew her own sword in reply, leaped to her horse, and led her now enormous army from the field. "Stupendous!" she heard King Coradulan marvel as he rode behind her. "Now you see why we follow her," King Anheg told him. "She is magnificent," King Coradulan declared. "Truly, my lords, such eloquence can only be a gift from the gods. I had viewed our enterprise with some trepidation, I confess it, but gladly would I challenge all the hosts of Angarak now. Heaven itself is with this marvelous child, and we cannot fail." "I will feel better after I see how the legions respond to her," King Rodar observed. "They are a pretty hard-bitten lot, and I think it might take a bit more than a speech about patriotism to move them." Tynedra, however, had already begun to work on that. She considered the problem from every angle as she sat alone in her tent that evening, brushing her hair. She needed something to stir her countrymen, and she instinctively knew what it must be. Quite suddenly, the silver amulet at her throat gave a strange little quiver, something it had never done before. Tynedra laid down her brush and touched her fingertips to the talisman. "I know you can hear me, father," she heard Polgara say. A sudden image rose in Tynedra's mind of Polgara wrapped in her blue cloak, standing atop a hill with the night breeze stirring her hair. "Have you regained your temper yet?" Belgarath's voice sounded wary. "We will talk about that some other time. What are you up to?" "At the moment, I'm up to my ears in drunk Nadraks. We're in a tavern in Yar Nadrak." "I might have guessed. Is Garion all right?" "Of course he is. I'm not going to let anything happen to him, Paul. Where are you?" "At Valmembre. We have raised the errands, and we are going on to Tolnedra in the morning." "Well, Ranbaroon won't like that very much." "We have a certain advantage. Tynedra is leading the army."
Tenedra? Belgariad sounded startled.
It seems that she was what the passage in the Codex meant. She has been preaching the errands out of the trees as if she owned them.
What an amazing thing.
Did you know that the southern Murgos are already gathered at Rakoska?
I've heard some rumors.
It changes things, you know.
Perhaps. Who's in charge of the army?
Rodar.
Good. Tell him to avoid anything major as long as possible, Paul. But keep the Angarax off my back.
We'll do what we can. She seemed to hesitate for a moment. Are you all right, Father? She asked carefully. The question seemed important for some reason.
Do you mean, am I still in full possession of my faculties? He sounded amused. Garion told me that you were worried about that.
I told him not to say anything.
By the time he got around to it, the whole question was pretty much academic.
Are you... I mean, can you still...
Everything seems to work the same as always, Paul.
Give my love to Garion.
Of course. Don't make a habit of this, but keep in touch with me.
Very well, Father. The amulet under Senedra's fingers quivered again. Then Polgaraz's voice spoke quite firmly. All right, Senedra, the sorceress said. You can stop eavesdropping now. Guiltily, Senedra jerked her fingers from the amulet. The next morning, even before the sun came up, she sent for Barak and Dernick. I'm going to need every scrap of Engarak gold in the entire army, she announced to them. Every single coin. Buy it from the men if you have to, but get me all of the red gold you can lay your hands on.
I don't suppose that you would care to tell us why, Barak said sourly.
The big man was surly about being pulled from his bed before daylight. I am a Tonedran, she informed him, and I know my countrymen. I think I am going to need some bait.
Chapter 27. Ranborun the 23rd, Emperor of Tonedra, was livid with rage. Tinedra noticed with a certain pang that her father had aged considerably in the year that she had been absent, and she wished that their meeting might be more cordial than this one promised to be. The emperor had drawn up his legions on the plains of northern Tonedra, and they faced Tinedra's army as it emerged from the forest of Vordu. The sun was warm, and the crimson standards of the legions, rising from what seemed to be a vast sea of brightly burnished steel, waved imposingly in the summer breeze. The massed legions had taken up positions along the crest of a line of low hills, and they looked down at Tinedra's sprawling army with the tactical advantage of terrain in their favor. King Rodar quietly pointed this out to the young queen as they dismounted to meet the emperor. We definitely don't want to provoke anything here, he advised her. Try your best to be polite, at least.
I know what I'm doing, Your Majesty,
she replied airily, removing her helmet and carefully smoothing her hair.
Tinedra,
Rodar said bluntly, taking her arm in a firm grasp.
You have been playing this on your veins since the first day we landed on the hook of Orindia. You don't know from one minute to the next what you're going to do. I most definitely do not propose to attack the Tonedran legions uphill, so be civil to your father, or I will take you over my knee and spank you. Do you understand me?
Rodar!
Tinedra gasped.
What a terrible thing to say.
I mean every word. You mind your manners, young lady.
Of course I will,
she promised. She gave him a sly little girl look through fluttering eyelashes.
Do you still love me, Rodar?
She asked in a tiny voice. He gave her a helpless look, and then she patted his broad cheek.
Everything will be just fine then,
she assured him.
Here comes my father.
Tinedra,
Ranborun demanded angrily, striding to meet them.
Just exactly. What do you think you're doing?
The emperor was dressed in gold-embossed armor,
and Tinedra thought he looked rather silly in it.
"I am just passing through, Father,"
she replied as inoffensively as possible.
"You have been well, I trust?"
"I was, until you violated my borders. Where did you get this army?"
"Here and there, Father,"
she shrugged.
"We really ought to talk, you know. Someplace private."
"I don't have anything to say to you,"
the bald-headed little man declared.
"I refuse to talk to you until you get this army off of Tonedran soil."
"Oh, Father,"
she reprimanded him.
"Stop being so childish."
"Childish?"
the Emperor exploded.
"Childish?"
"Her Majesty perhaps chose the wrong word," King Rodar interposed, giving Tinedra a hard look. "As we all know, she tends at times to be a trifle undiplomatic."
"What are you doing here, Rodar?"
Ranbarun demanded. He looked around quickly at the other kings.
"Why have the Alons invaded Tonedra?"
"We have not invaded you, Ranbarun," Anheg told him. "If we had, the smoke from burning towns and villages would be rising behind us. You know how we make war."
"What are you doing here, then?"
King Kohag answered in a calm voice.
"As Her Majesty advised you, we are only passing through on our way to the east."
"And exactly what do you plan to do in the east?" "That is our business," Anheg told him bluntly. "Try to be civil," Lady Polgara said to the Kerek king. She turned to the Emperor. "My father and I explained to you what was happening last summer, Ranbarun. Were you not listening?"
"That was before you stole my daughter," he retorted. "What have you done to her? She was difficult before, but now she is absolutely impossible."
"Children grow up, Your Majesty," Polgara replied philosophically. The Queen's point was well taken, however. We do need to talk, preferably in private.
"What Queen are we talking about?"
the Emperor asked bitingly.
"I don't see any Queen here."
Tinedra's eyes hardened.
"Father, you know what's happening. Now stop playing games and talk sense. This is very important."
"Your Highness knows me well enough to know that I do not play games,"
he told her in an icy tone.
"Your Majesty?"
she corrected him.
"Your Highness,"
he insisted.
"Your Majesty,"
she repeated, her voice going up an octave.
"Your Highness,"
he snarled, from between clenched teeth. "Do we really need to squabble like bad-tempered children right in front of the armies?" Polgara asked calmly.
"She's right, you know,"
Rodar said to Ranbarun.
"We're all beginning to look a bit foolish out here. We ought to try to maintain the fiction of dignity, at least."
The Emperor glanced involuntarily over one shoulder at the glittering ranks of his legions drawn up on the hilltops not far away.
"Very well," he conceded grudgingly. "But I want it clearly understood that the only thing we're going to talk about is your withdrawal from Tonedran soil. If you will follow me, we will go to my pavilion."
"Which stands right in the middle of your legions," King Anheg added.
"Forgive me, Ranbarun, but we are not that stupid. Why don't we go to my pavilion instead?" "I am no stupider than you are, Anheg," the Emperor retorted.
"If I may," King Fulrek said mildly, "in the interests of expediency, might we not assume that this spot is more or less neutral?" He turned to Brindig. "Colonel, would you be so good as to have a large tent erected here?" "At once, Your Majesty," the sober-faced Brindig replied. King Rodar grinned.
"As you can see, the legendary practicality of the Sindars is not a myth."
The Emperor looked a bit sour, but finally seemed to remember his manners.
I have not seen you in a long time, Thorak. I hope that Layla is well. She sends her regards, the king of Cinderia replied politely. You've got good sense, Thorak, the emperor burst out. Why have you lent yourself to this insane adventure? I think that might be one of the things we ought to discuss in private, don't you? Belgariad suggested smoothly. How is the squabble over the succession going? Rodar asked in a tone of a man making small talk. It is still up in the air, Ranbaroon responded, also in a neutral manner. The Hornets seem to be joining forces, though. That's unfortunate, Rodar murmured. The Hornets have a bad reputation. Under Colonel Brendig's direction, a squad of Cindarian soldiers were quickly erecting a large, bright-colored pavilion on the green turf not far away.
Did you deal with Duke Kador, father?
Cinedra inquired. His Grace found his life burdensome, Ranbaroon replied with a short laugh. Someone rather carelessly left some poison lying about in his prison cell, and he sampled it extensively. We gave him a splendid funeral. Cinedra smiled.
I'm so sorry that I missed it.
The pavilion's ready now, King Thorak told them. Shall we go inside? They all entered and sat at the table the soldiers had placed inside. Lord Morin, the Emperor's chamberlain, held Cinedra's chair for her.
How has he been?
Cinedra whispered to the brown-mantled official. Not well, Princess, Morin replied. Your absence grieved him more than he cared to admit.
Is he eating well? And getting his rest?
We try, Highness, Morin shrugged. But your father's not the easiest person in the world to get along with.
Do you have his medicine?
Naturally, Highness. I never go anywhere without it. Suppose we get down to business, Rodar was saying. Taurugos has sealed his western border, and the southern Murgos have moved into position around Ragoska. Zakath, the Malorian emperor, has set up a staging area on the plains outside of Tulselek to receive his troops as he ferries them in. We are running out of time, Ranbaroon. I am negotiating with Taurugos, the emperor replied, and I will dispatch a plenipotentiary to Zakath immediately. I am certain this can be settled without a war. You can talk to Taurugos until your tongue falls out, Anheg snorted. And Zakath probably doesn't even know or care who you are. As soon as they have gathered their forces, they will march. This war cannot be avoided, and I, for one, am just as happy about that. Let us exterminate the Angaraks once and for all. Isn't that just a bit uncivilized, Anheg? Ranbaroon asked him. Your Imperial Majesty, King Corodulan said formally. The King of Harek speaks hastily, perhaps, but there is a wisdom in his words. Must we live forever, under the threat of invasion from the east? Might it not be best forever to quell them?
All of this is very interesting, Cinedra interrupted them coolly, but it is really beside the point. The actual point at issue here is that the Rivan King has returned, and Tolnedra is required by the provisions of the Accords of Omimbre to submit to his leadership.
Perhaps, her father replied, but young Belgariad seems to be absent. Have you misplaced him somewhere? Or is it perhaps that he still had pots to scrub in the scullery at Riva, so that you had to leave him behind?
That is beneath you, father, Cinedra said scornfully. The overlord of the West requires your service. Are you going to shame the Baroons and Tolnedra by abrogating the accords?
Oh, no, daughter, he said, holding up one hand. Tolnedra always meticulously observes every clause of every treaty she has ever signed. The accords require me to submit to Belgariad, and I will do precisely that, just as soon as he comes here and tells me that he wants me to.
I am acting in his stead, Tinedra announced.
I don't seem to recall anything that states that the authority is transferable.
I am the Rivan Queen,
Tinedra retorted hotly.
And I have been invested with co-rulership by Belgariad himself.
The wedding must have been very private. I am a little hurt that I was not invited.
The wedding will take place in due time, Father. In the meantime, I speak for Belgariad and for Riva.
Speak all you want, girl. I am not obliged to listen, however. At the moment, you are only the betrothed of the Rivan King. You are not his wife, and therefore not his queen. If we want to be strictly legal about it, until such time as you do marry, you are still under my authority. Perhaps if you apologize and get out of that stupid-looking armor and put on proper clothing, I will forgive you. Otherwise, I will be forced to punish you.
Punish? Punish?
Don't scream at me, Tinedra, the Emperor said hotly.
Things seem to be deteriorating rapidly, Barak observed dryly to Anheg. I noticed that, Anheg agreed.
I am the Rivan Queen,
Tinedra shouted at her father now. You are a silly girl, he shot back at her.
That does it, Father,
she declared, leaping to her feet.
You will deliver command of your legions to me at once, and then you will return to Tolhanath, where your servants can wrap you in shawls and feed you gruel, since you are obviously too senile to be of any further use to me.
Senile? The Emperor roared at her, also jumping up. Get out of my sight! Take your stinking Elon army out of Tinedra at once, or I will order my legions to throw you out!
Tinedra, however, was already storming toward the door of the tent.
You come back here, he raged at her. I have not finished talking to you yet.
Yes, you have, Father,
she shouted back.
Now I am going to talk. Barak, I need that sack you have tied to your saddle.
She rushed from the tent and climbed onto her horse, spluttering with apparent fury. Are you sure that you know what you are doing? Barak asked her as he tied the sack of Angarak coins to her saddle.
Perfectly,
she replied in a calm voice. Barak's eyes narrowed as he looked at her. You seem to have regained your temper in a remarkably short time.
I never lost it, Barak.
You were acting in there?
Obviously. Well, at least partially. It will take my father an hour or so to regain his composure, and by then it will be too late. Tell Rodar and the others to prepare the army to march. The legions will be joining us.
What makes you think that?
I'm going to fetch them, right now.
She turned to Mandaralan, who had just emerged from the tent.
Where have you been? She asked. Come along, I need an escort.
Where are we going, Pry? The knight asked.
You'll see, she told him,
and she turned her mount and rode at a trot up the hillside toward the massed legions. Mandaralan exchanged a helpless look with Barak, and then clanged into his saddle to follow. Tinedra, riding ahead, carefully put her fingertips to her amulet.
Lady Polgra,
she whispered.
Can you hear me?
She was not certain that the amulet would work that way, but she had to try.
Lady Polgra,
she whispered again, a bit more urgently.
What are you doing, Tinedra?
Polgra's voice sounded quite clearly in the little queen's ears.
I'm going to talk to the legions,
Tinedra answered.
Can you fix it so they will hear me? All of them?
Yes, but the legions won't be much interested in a speech about patriotism.
I've got a different one,
Tinedra assured her. Your father is having a fit in here. He's actually foaming at the mouth. Tinedra sighed regretfully.
I know. Happens fairly often. Lord Moran has the medicine with him. Please try to keep him from biting his tongue."
"You goaded him into this deliberately, didn't you, Zenidra?"
"I needed time to talk to the legions,"
the princess replied.
"The fit won't really hurt him very much. He's had fits all of his life. He'll have a nosebleed and a terrible headache when it's over. Please take care of him, Lady Polgra. I do love him, you know."
"I'll see what I can do, but you and I are going to have a long talk about this, young lady. There are some things you just don't do."
"I didn't have any choice, Lady Polgra. This is for Garion. Please, do what you have to do so that the legions can hear me. It is awfully important."
"All right, Zenidra, but don't do anything foolish." And then the voice was gone. Zenidra quickly scanned the standards drawn up before her, selected the familiar emblem of the 83rd Legion, and rode toward it. It was necessary that she place herself in front of men who would recognize her and confirm her identity to the rest of her father's army. The 83rd was primarily a ceremonial unit, and by tradition its barracks were inside the imperial compound at Tol Hanath. It was a select group, still limited to the traditional 1,000 men, and it served primarily as a palace guard. Zenidra knew every man in the 83rd by sight, and most of them by name. Confidently, she approached them.
"Colonel Albor,"
she said courteously, greeting the commander of the 83rd, a stout man with a florid face and a touch of gray at his temples.
"Your Highness," the colonel replied with a respectful inclination of his head, "we have missed you at the palace." Zenidra knew that to be a lie. The duty of guarding her person had been one of the common stakes in barracks dice games, with the honor always going to the loser.
"I need a small favor, Colonel,"
she said to him as winsomely as she could. "If it is in my power, Highness," he answered, hedging a bit.
"I wish to address my father's legions," she explained, "and I want them to know who I am."
She smiled at him, warmly, insincerely. Albor was a Horbite, and Zenidra privately detested him.
"Since the 83rd practically raised me," she continued, "you of all people should recognize me and be able to identify me."
"That is true, Your Highness," Albor admitted.
"Do you suppose you could send runners to the other legions to inform them just who I am?"
"At once, Your Highness," Albor agreed. He obviously saw nothing dangerous in her request. For a moment, Zenidra almost felt sorry for him. The runners, trotters actually, since members of the 83rd were not very athletic, began to circulate through the massed legions. Zenidra chatted the while with Colonel Albor and his officers, though she kept a watchful eye on the tent where her father was recuperating from his seizure, and also on the gold-colored canopy beneath which the Tolnedran general staff was assembled. She definitely did not want some curious officer riding over to ask what she was doing. Finally, when she judged that any further delay might be dangerous, she politely excused herself. She turned her horse, and, with Mandoralin close behind her, she rode back out to a spot where she was certain she could be seen.
"Sound your horn, Mandoralin,"
she told her knight. "We are some distance from our own forces, Your Majesty. I pray thee, be moderate in thine address. Even I might experience some difficulty in facing the massed legions of old Tornedra." She smiled at him.
"You know you can trust me, Mandoralin."
"With my life, Your Majesty," he replied, and lifted his horn to his lips. As his last ringing notes faded, Zenidra, her stomach churning with the now familiar nausea, rose in her stirrups to speak.
"Legionnaires,"
she called to them,
"I am Princess Zenidra, the daughter of your emperor."
It was not perhaps the best beginning in the world, but she had to start somewhere, and this was going to be something in the nature of a performance rather than an oration, so a bit of awkwardness in places wouldn't hurt anything.
"I have come to set your minds at rest," she continued. "The army massed before you comes in peace. This fair green field, this sacred Tolnedran soil, shall not be a battleground this day. For today at least, no legionnaire will shed his blood in defense of the Empire."
A ripple of relief passed through the massed legions. No matter how professional soldiers might be, an avoided battle was always good news. Tinedra drew in a deep, quivering breath. It needed just a little twist now, something to lead logically to what she really wanted to say.
"Today, you will not be called upon to die for your brass half-crown."
The brass half-crown was the legionnaire's standard daily pay.
"I cannot, however, speak for tomorrow. No one can say when the affairs of the Empire will demand that you lay down your lives. It may be tomorrow that the interests of some powerful merchant may need legion blood for protection."
She lifted her hands in a rueful little gesture.
"But then, that is the way it has always been, hasn't it? The legions die for brass so that others might have gold."
A cynical laugh of agreement greeted that remark. Tinedra had heard enough of the idle talk of her father's soldiers to know that this complaint was at the core of every legionnaire's view of the world. Blood and gold. Our blood for their gold. It was very nearly a legion motto. They were almost with her now. The quivering in her stomach subsided a bit, and her voice became stronger. She told them a story then. A story she had heard in a half-dozen versions since her childhood. It was the story of a good legionnaire who did his duty and saved his money. His wife had suffered through the hardships and separations that went with being married to a legionnaire. When he was mustered out of his legion, they had gone home and bought a little shop, and all the years of sacrifice seemed worthwhile.
"And then one day, his wife became very ill,"
Tinedra continued her story.
"and the physician's fee was very high."
She had been carefully untying the sack fastened to her saddle while she spoke.
"The physician demanded this much," she said,
taking 3 blood-red Murgo coins from the sack and holding them up for all to see.
"And the legionnaire went to a powerful merchant and borrowed the money to pay the physician. But the physician, like most of them, was a fraud, and the legionnaire's money might as well have been thrown away."
Quite casually, Tinedra tossed the gold coins into the high grass behind her.
"The soldier's good and faithful wife died, and when the legionnaire was bowed down with grief, the powerful merchant came to him and said, 'Where is the money I lent to you?'
She took out 3 more coins and held them up.
'Where is that good red gold I gave you to pay the physician?'
But the legionnaire had no gold, she told them.
His hands were empty."
She spread her fingers, letting the gold coins fall to the ground.
"And so, the merchant took the legionnaire's shop to pay the debt. A rich man grew richer. And what happened to the legionnaire? Well, he still had his sword. He had been a good soldier, so he had kept it bright and sharp. And after his wife's funeral, he took his sword and went out into a field not far from the town. And he fell upon it. And that's how the story ends."
She had them now. She could see it in their faces. The story she had told them had been around for a long time, but the gold coins she had so casually tossed away gave it an entirely new emphasis. She took out several of the Angarak coins and looked at them curiously, as if seeing them for the first time.
"Why do you suppose that all of the gold we see these days is red?"
she asked them.
"I always thought gold was supposed to be yellow. Where does all of this red gold come from?"
"From Solmurgos," several of them answered her.
"Really?"
She looked at the coins with an apparent distaste.
"What is Murgo gold doing in Tolnedra?"
And she threw the coins away. The iron discipline of the legions wavered, and they all took an involuntary step forward.
Of course, I don't suppose an ordinary soldier sees much red gold. Why should a Murgo try to bribe a common soldier when he can bribe the officers? Or the powerful men who decide where and when the legions are to go to bleed and die?
She took out another coin and looked at it.
Do you know, I think that every single one of these is from Xolmurgos.
She said it negligently, throwing the coin away.
Do you suppose that the Murgos are trying to buy up Tonedra?
There was an angry mutter at that.
There must be a great deal of this red gold lying about in the Angarak kingdoms, if that's what they have in mind, wouldn't you say? I have heard stories about that, though. Don't they say that the mines of Xolmurgos are bottomless, and that there are rivers in Gorognadrak that look like streams of blood, because the gravel over which they flow is pure gold? Why, gold must be as cheap as dirt in the lands of the East.
She took out another coin, glanced at it, then tossed it away. The legions took another involuntary step forward. The officers barked the command to stand fast, but they also looked hungrily toward the tall grass where the princess had been so indifferently throwing the red gold coins.
It may be that the army I am leading will be able to find out just how much gold lies on the ground in the lands of the Angaraks,
Tinedra confided to them.
The Murgos and the Grolums have been practicing this same kind of deceit in Arindia and Sindaria and the Elorn kingdoms. We are on our way to chastise them for it.
She stopped, as if an idea had just occurred to her.
There is always room in an army for a few more good soldiers,
she mused thoughtfully.
I know that most legionnaires serve out of loyalty to their legions and love for Tonedra. But there may be a few among you who are not satisfied with 1 brass half-crown a day. I am sure such men would be welcome in my army.
She took another red coin out of her dwindling supply.
Would you believe that there's another Murgo gold piece?
She demanded, and let the coin drop from her fingers. A sound went through the massed legions that was almost a groan. The princess sighed then.
I forgot something, she said regretfully. My army is leaving at once, and it takes weeks for a legionnaire to arrange for leave, doesn't it?
Who needs a leave? Someone shouted.
You wouldn't actually desert your legions, would you?
She asked them incredulously. The princess offers gold, another man roared. Let Ranborun keep his brass. Tinedra dipped one last time into the bag and took out the last few coins.
Would you actually follow me?
She asked in her most little girl voice.
Just for this?
And she let the coins trickle out of her hand. The Emperor's general staff at that point made a fatal mistake. They dispatched a platoon of cavalry to take the princess into custody. Seeing mounted men riding toward the ground Tinedra had so liberally strewn with gold, and mistaking their intent, the legions broke. Officers were swarmed under and trampled as Ranbarun's army lunged forward to scramble in the grass for the coins. I prythee, your majesty, Mandaralan urged, drawing his sword, let us withdraw to safety.
In a moment, Sir Mandaralan,
Tinedra replied, quite calmly. She stared directly at the desperately greedy legionnaires running toward her.
My army marches immediately, she announced. If the Imperial legions wish to join us, I welcome them.
And with that she wheeled her horse and galloped back toward her own forces, with Mandaralan at her side. Behind her she heard the heavy tread of thousands of feet. Someone among the massed legions began to chant, and it was a chant that soon spread. "Se Nedra! Se Nedra! Se Nedra!" they shouted, and their heavy steps marked time to the chant. The Princess Tinedra, her sun-touched hair streaming in the wind behind her, galloped on. leading the mass mutiny of the legions. Even as she rode, Tinedra knew that her every word had been a deception. There would be no more wealth for these legionnaires than there would be glory or easy victory for the Arins that she had gathered from the forests of Asturia and the plains of Mimbre. She had raised an army to lead into a hopeless war. It was for love of Geryon, however, and perhaps for even more. If the prophecy that so controlled their destinies demanded this of her, there was no way she could have refused. Despite all of the anguish that lay ahead, she would have done this and more. For the first time, Tinedra accepted the fact that she no longer controlled her own destiny. Something infinitely more powerful than she commanded her, and she must obey. Polgara and Belgarath, with lives spanning aeons, could perhaps devote themselves to an idea, a concept. But Tinedra was barely 16 years old, and she needed something more human to arouse her devotion. At this very moment, somewhere in the forests of Garagnadrak, there was a sandy-haired young man with a serious face, whose safety, whose very life, depended on every effort that she could muster. The princess surrendered, finally, to love. She swore to herself that she would never fail her Geryon. If this army were not enough, she would raise another, at whatever cost. Tinedra sighed, then squared her shoulders and led the Tolnedran legions across the sunny fields to swell the ranks of her army. Here ends Book 4 of the Belgariad. Book 5, Enchanter's Endgame, brings this epic to a brilliant conclusion as Belgariad confronts evil Torak to decide the fate of men, gods, and prophecies.